scary stories. My husband and I were at the supermarket, and our baby was being especially fussy, so he took her for a quick drive, the motion of which usually calms her down. It only took about 10 minutes to settle her, and I was in the store, but was unsure how much longer I'd be, and there's poor reception inside. So he pulled back into the parking lot to wait for me. It was an unseasonably nice day, so he took her in her car seat to sit on one of the benches outside the store. He took a business call and just sat them down, absent-mindedly rocking the carrier, when a woman, well-dressed, mid-30s, average height, fit build, approached them. It's not uncommon for people to ask to play with our baby. She's got big rosy cheeks, soft wisps of golden hair, and the most adorable, toothless grin, especially when she's deep into a good nap. But her nap schedule is paramount, so my husband was preparing to tell the woman she actually couldn't play with our baby right then. She walked over right in their direction, brimming with nonchalant confidence, and before he could even finish his sentence explaining she was napping and not to be touched, she picked up the carrier and started walking off. He was in shock for a moment, not fully believing someone would be so ballsy enough to do something so sinister in plain daylight. So he said, "Excuse me, put her down," as his panic mounted. She remained calm this entire time, but when he called after her, she started walking away more briskly. He ran full speed ahead and tried to grapple the carrier out of her hands, finally resulting to restraining her arms. The woman yells, "Help! He's trying to take my baby! Kidnapping! 911! Help!" kicking him in the shin and pulling a pink bottle of pepper spray out of her handbag. Of course, no one in the parking lot was clocking the earlier interaction and assumed he was really a kidnapper, a lone man in a Deadpool t-shirt versus a tiny well-dressed woman. Immediately, a man drop-kicked my husband to the ground and was holding him down. He could hear bystanders encouraging the woman to file a police report, but she was doing a very convincing job of acting shaken up and insisted she just wanted to go home. To make matters worse for my husband, she was driving a minivan. He was in a raw state of panic, realizing the entire parking lot had banded together to inadvertently facilitate the kidnapping of our daughter. He was begging and pleading with them. No one was listening. They just kept screaming at him that the jig was up and he needed to lie still and wait for the police and stop terrorizing a young mother. My husband finally had the novel idea to show them family pictures on his phone, but too panicked to think clearly. This manifested as he shouted, "I have pictures of the baby on my phone," which of course everyone interpreted as having either stalking pictures or worse, pornographic images of the baby. It was at this point that a man, I can't entirely blame the man considering what he thought was going on, kicked my husband as hard as he could in the ribs. It was at this point I was coming out of the store and thought he was being robbed by these people. I was yelling for security, so panicked my chest constricted and I could barely get any sound out. It was only then I realized he did not have our baby with him. When I saw she was being held by a woman, I was relieved. I thought maybe the woman had intervened to move my daughter out of harm's way while my husband was being robbed and was walking away to get help. I couldn't find a security guard outside the store, so I ran up to the people holding my husband down, waving my wallet, pleading, "Take everything you want, just let him up and leave us alone." And one of the men holding my husband down said something like, "Lady, we need to wait for the police to deal with him." And I was so confused. Why would the muggers have called the police? I just kept stammering, "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" And made out someone yelling, "He tried to abduct the woman's kid." I did not understand, and I was sure I misheard him. My husband never hurt a child, and we have 4 kids. If he were going to commit a crime, bringing home another kid would be at the bottom of his list. I kept trying to understand what the man was saying, and suddenly it all clicked. I looked around for the woman who had the baby carrier, and she was halfway across the parking lot. I went into total ballistic trigger cub mode, literally leaped out of my heels, and sprinted across the parking lot. I'm not a UFC fighter. I've never taken any self-defense classes, so all I could think of was to grab the woman by her hair and squeeze her throat with my other hand, which didn't do much. She was getting away even as I grappled her. Amazingly, none of the other bystanders had yet to connect that my husband was telling the truth, and this woman was abducting our baby. I yanked her hair as hard as I could, and that was enough for her to drop the carrier. I was so scared and surprised that I actually threw myself on top of the carrier, covering the entire thing in a blanket, and stayed that way without saying or doing anything. The woman left. Not one person tried to stop her, even though she was clearly leaving without the child she claimed was hers, which would be pretty damn incriminating if I had watched this scene unfold. Within the next couple of minutes, police had arrived. After all that, there were still several bystanders who explained it was all my husband trying to kidnap the baby. The police, in my horror, assumed that she must have had bad intentions. The first question they asked me after getting her description weren't investigative. They were questions thinly veiled, trying to convince me not to pursue charges, still placing blame on my husband. A small sample. Does your husband and the baby look dissimilar? Could your husband have been doing something inappropriate or violent to the baby that would make her feel compelled to grab the baby from the situation? Did she seem groggy or confused? Could she have mistaken either of them for her own family members? They spent more time verifying the baby was actually mine than they concerned themselves with the fact that the baby was actually not hers. My husband had called his brother at this point, who works in an office with a lot of lawyers, and connected with one ASAP, who gave us the priceless advice to get every officer's name and badge number, to request copies of the store's security tapes right away, and to escalate our complaint higher up the chain if these officers weren't taking us seriously. Finally, we had reason enough to believe we were being taken seriously, and we went home and both just shook and cried until we had to get our other kids from school. My husband seething with rage and grappling a feeling of helplessness from how little he was able to do, and has 2 cracked ribs from when the man kicked him. To the officer's credit, they did ask if he'd like to press charges, but considering the man was genuinely convinced at the time that he was on the right side of intervening in a kidnapping, and stayed to talk to the police and apologize profusely when the truth became clear, he denied to press charges. Amazingly and frustratingly, there were still people who stuck around to talk to the police, who were giving my husband dirty looks, and one man who even implored the police to involve CPS to verify it was really our baby. There is a girl that has been stalking and harassing me since October 2018. We were in the same class in high school 6 years ago. She was super shy, never spoke in class, and barely had any friends. I can't remember speaking to her more than once or twice through all of high school. To me, she did not even exist. Then, all of a sudden, many months ago, I woke up to a message in my Facebook inbox that read, "Fuck white people." She is Asian. From what country, I do not know. I thought this was really strange, so I tried to reply back, "What's going on?" But she had blocked my messages. I decided to just ignore it and go on with my life. About a month had passed, and I woke up to yet another message in my inbox. She had sent me a screenshot of an Instagram account in my name. No posts or followers, just an empty account with my name. I kind of freaked out a little and tried to reply, but yet again she had blocked my messages. I tried to find the account on Instagram, but could not. My name is very uncommon, so the possibilities that this was another guy's account was very slim. It certainly wasn't my account. I was very confused and kinda scared that she had created an account with my name and would post things pretending to be me. I contacted one of her high school friends and asked if she could deliver a message for me since I had no way of reaching her. To my surprise, they weren't friends anymore and hadn't spoken in months. I told my closest friends about what had been happening. They told me that they received some strange messages too. I was seriously confused by this point. This one girl nobody talked to or had any kind of relationship with was sending pictures on Instagram accounts, weird memes, and 3-word sentences that made 0 sense to me and many of my friends. I tried to think of why she did this. Had we treated her badly at some point? But I could not think of anything that we had done. I remember giving her a piece of gum one day, but that is about as close to any communication that happened between us. I decided I would just try to ignore her and hope she would not send me any more messages. But then, around Christmas time, I woke up to my Facebook exploding with notifications and messages. I think I had around a good 100+ notifications. She had been sharing all of my profile pictures and posts. I am seriously freaking out at this point, and opened Messenger. I have received 56 messages that all read, "Kill yourself." I tried to message her again, but surprise, surprise, she had blocked my messages. I was becoming really angry at this point. I clicked on her Facebook profile to block her and get rid of her for good. Before I went to block her, I scrolled down her wall, and she had been sharing literally hundreds of posts and pictures of me, my friends, and some other people I had no idea who they were. I did some detective work and found her sister's Facebook profile and decided to send her a message. I took screenshots of everything she had done and sent it to her, asking why she was doing this. She freaked out when she saw what her crazy stalker sister had done. The stalker had deleted her sister on Facebook because of an argument they had around October when this all started. So she hadn't seen anything she had done. She promised me she would talk to her crazy stalker sister and make her stop. I received a message from the sister a few hours later that she had talked to the stalker and promised she would stop, and she apologized. I was so happy this finally would be over and thanked her. Another few months passes. We are now in February 2019. I hadn't received any messages since I talked to her sister, and I had honestly forgot about everything that had happened. 2 days ago, I was playing some games with my friends on my PC talking on Discord. My phone was on the table, and I saw it lit up once. I had received a notification. I wouldn't bother to check it before the game was done. A few seconds after, I get another one, and another one. I could see my phone in the corner of my eye. Notifications came swarming in. Then I remembered the crazy stalker girl and got a really awful feeling in my stomach. Praying this wasn't her again, I stopped playing and picked up the phone. Notifications still swarming in. The stalker was sharing my pictures and posts yet again. And all had a caption like, "Kill yourself," or "I hope you die." I instantly blocked her. A few minutes later, it happened again. Someone with another username was sharing my pictures. I blocked the account instantly. She had created at least 10 accounts, and I was desperately blocking all of them as fast as I could as soon as I saw a notification. I sent her sister a message again and told her I was going to report this to the police if she wouldn't stop. She told me she would talk to her. Angry, confused, and kinda scared, I went back to the gaming session, talking to my friends about it. I went to sleep a few hours later. I woke up late the next day. It was hard to sleep after thinking about all that was happening. My cousin had received some messages from my crazy stalker. She had told him that I owed her money. I kept my calm and told him about everything and said that he should just go with it. I wanted to see where this was going. She thought my cousin was my father. He was a lot older than me, so I could see why she would think that. They had a long conversation where she claimed that I had both stolen and hacked her phone and lent money from her, and that I was the reason she lost her scholarship and had to move. She said I owed her $10,000, which later became $50,000, and then again she raised the amount to $100,000 later in the conversation. All of this is, of course, a crazy lie. I'm so confused of why she is doing this to me. I have no idea what I have done to her, and I'm going to report this to the police tomorrow. I'm really fucking scared of what she might accuse me of next, or if she is going to show up on my doorstep one day. All of this happening 6 years after the last time I saw her. So I just came back home after talking with the police. They told me I had a strong case and could press charges if I wanted to. I decided not to do it for now. I don't want to make it harder than it has to be. I will give her one last chance to stop. They will call her today and tell her to stop or face charges. Any further contact with me or my family will cause her to see consequences. Either way, I'm pretty much guaranteed to get her a restraining order if she doesn't comply. I would also like to add that I do not think she is a violent person, and she has never threatened my life directly, nor have I ever feared for my life. This plays a huge part of why I did not press charges. I firmly believe that something terrible has happened to her within the last year, and that she is really sick and in need of help. Her family know about the situation, and it's up to them or the authorities to make sure she gets help if she needs it. What bothered me the most about this whole situation was the false accusations, and not the sharing of pictures and messages itself. I am happy with my decision, and I hope I have made the right call. This story extends from 8th grade middle school to my freshman year in college. I'm 24 years old now, so this must have began in 2008. I was raised in a Korean household with strong Christian beliefs. Every summer and winter, there would be a youth retreat where all of the teens in our church would go to one big joint retreat with counselors and teenagers from churches in and out of the state. I met my best friend, Hannah, there. She was from Philly and had a pastor who was white, who we called Pastor Allen. After these retreats, everyone would add each other on Facebook and keep in touch. I remember a day or two after the 2008 summer retreat, Pastor Allen would often reach out and ask how my talk with God was going since the retreat, and if I ever need someone to speak to, I could always confide in him. This didn't alarm me at the time because counselors would keep in touch all the time. I always kept our conversations brief considering the fact I was shy and timid. Over the years, I had seen Pastor Allen at retreats and was friendly with him. Nothing strange happened other than his persistence With keeping in touch with me on Facebook after retreats, I slowly stopped talking to him, and eventually, we didn't speak at all. This is where it all starts to get weird. One day, after our summer retreat in 2011, I got a friend request from a woman named Sumiko. I noticed we had a lot of mutual friends from the retreat, so I assumed she was a counselor there. She messaged me immediately after I accepted the request. Her and I became quickly acquainted. At the time, I was 15, and she was everything I needed in an older sister. Although we never met, I let my naivety get the best of me and confided in her about my teenage girl troubles. After months in, I remember walking into church and asking one of my youth leaders if they had met her at the retreat. He said he had never heard of her. I asked him if he could go check the roster, and he did, only to find out there was no Sumiko on the list. That's when things started to get super eerie for me. I panicked and went home to block Sumiko off of my Facebook. I saw on her page that the only person who continued to tell her it was nice seeing her was Pastor Allen. No one else from the retreat seemed to really be interacting with her. It all started to freak me out. I blocked her and unfriended Pastor Allen. I remember no longer attending these church retreats. A few days later, I received an email telling me that Sumiko decided to attempt suicide because of me, and that the email was coming from the mental hospital she was staying at. They told me it was all my fault. I was a junior in high school under high amounts of stress from SATs, and I deleted the email because I just wanted to forget about it all and focus on studying. Shortly after, I started to receive really unfriendly anonymous messages on my Tumblr. They would tell me that I was going to burn in hell for eternity if I continued to stray from God. They continued all the way into my senior year in high school. I always deleted and ignored them, or I'd reply sarcastically and laugh at them with my friends. Eventually, the messages faded and I didn't hear much from them anymore. In 2012, I got accepted to a close-by Christian college and moved into my dorm. My dorm floor decided to have a little icebreaker meeting to help us get comfortable. I met another Korean girl and began talking about our similarities in our childhood being raised Korean with Christian parents. I opened up to her about the encounter with Pastor Allen, and midway through the story, I saw her face slowly dropping and getting pale. She told me she had a very similar encounter with a pastor she knew, and that he was also a white man working with the youth in an all-Korean church. I asked her where she was from, and she replied with the same state that Pastor Allen was from. She then asked me if the name of the pastor was Pastor Allen. We had the same predator in our lives at the same age. I'm not sure where Pastor Allen is now, but I pray to God that he has not harmed any little Korean girls. It's absolutely disgusting. He was borderline 60 years old when I was 14 or 15. It makes me sick knowing people prey on children in the most vulnerable ways. It ruined a lot about my perspective on Christianity as well. It's horrible to take something so spiritual and take advantage of a child with it. So Pastor Allen, with a creepy young Asian girl fetish, let's never ever meet again. I was staying at a West End in Atlanta. I stay at hotels a lot, and I generally think of them as being safe places. On the day of this event, I was terribly hungover, so hungover that I could barely get out of bed. but I had a hair appointment that I had already made a 50% deposit on, so I essentially had to pull myself together. I threw up several times before I got there. However, I eventually made it. Afterwards, I threw up on the way back. It was that bad. When I made it back to the hotel, it was between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. It wasn't even nightfall. I got on the elevator to go up to my room, and it was packed with people. I was visibly sick, sweating, and trying to prevent myself from throwing up in a crowded elevator. I could not hold it in long enough to make it to my floor, so I got off at the first chance. I was on my knees puking in a trash can by the elevator before the doors even opened. While puking, I noticed a man hovering behind me. He was well dressed and about 45 to 50. Out of embarrassment, I apologized for throwing up in public between heaves. He said, "I saw you on the elevator, but I didn't realize we were on the same floor." Still puking, I informed him that I wasn't on this floor. He told me he was going to get me some help. Attempting to decline his offer, he just grabbed me by the elbow, pulled me from the ground, and started quickly dragging me down the hall. I was really out of it and didn't understand what was happening. By then, we were nearly halfway down the hall. I quickly realized that housekeeping had gone home for the day. There was no staff or patrons on the floor that I could see. I started getting really loud and he stopped dragging me. Still, he didn't release me, so I kind of had to wiggle away. I ran back to the elevator and got on. Just before the doors closed, he put his arm in and boarded the elevator with me. I pressed the button to my floor, and he got off with me. My room was at the end of the hall. I quickly walked back to my room, got the key to open my door, and tried to close it, only to find that his foot was blocking me from doing so. A small struggle that lasted about 8 seconds ensued. I eventually was able to close the door and put the security latch on it. Then I slid to the floor and started crying. Who was this man? Why was he doing this? If he wanted to help me, then why didn't he? What was he trying to do? I don't know, but I certainly hope that we never meet again. I work on a small dairy farm in the upper Midwest. It kinda has a weird layout, but I'll try my best. Right when you walk in, there's the milk house, then you keep going, and you're in the parlor. Once you go to the edge of the parlor, you can turn left into the calf barn, or right and make your way out to the big barn where the milking cows are. Also, I should mention that the calf barn is connected to an older barn that we keep pregnant cows in. The doors are never locked because we have people coming in at random times throughout the day. Plus, it's a barn, and there are doors literally everywhere, and I mean everywhere. Anyways, I'm a female who is fairly thin, maybe 5'5", 120-ish pounds, and mind you, I'm still in high school. One night I was working the night shift, so anywhere between 8:30 to 2 a.m., because you never know how long farm work might take sometimes. Every shift we work with one other person, and this night happened to be with another high schooler about my age, but she's a bit taller than me. But every shift we milk the first bin, then I'll go into the calf barn and turn the lights on and start pasteurizing so I can feed the calves. So I went and did that, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and I went back to help milk the second bin. After the second pen, I went to feed the calves. So here's a layout of the calf barn. There's an alley down with the weaned calves in the left and hay and grain on the right for feeding. Then at the end of it is a big room. There's a row of 7 hutches right as you walk in, from left to right, and then 2 in the left corner Then there's 6 pens, 3 on each side, with a little milk house in the middle for the feeding purposes. The doors on the milk house are always closed to keep in warm air. So I go in there and start my normal feeding routine, still not noticing anything strange. Then I open the door on the other side of the milk house to feed the far pens, and that's when I noticed the older, almost weaned calves in the right pen were very skittish. I just ignored it at first, went about what I was doing, and then I saw him, a man huddled in the corner of the pen, just sitting there and all black and bundled up because it was cold as hell out there that night. But as he sat there just looking at me, smiling, in between those far 2 pens is a double door that again isn't locked, making it easier for someone to get in. Anyways, I was holding a 5-liter bucket filled with milk and dropped it, spilling it all over the ground. I've never booked it so fast out of there. I told my coworker what had happened, and we hid out in the break room for a little bit with our barn dog. We eventually got the courage to go back and check it out, but the man was gone. He never threatened us, or the cows, and nothing went missing. I don't know if he was a homeless man looking for shelter in the cold, or what, but my barn is a tad far out of town for that. What scares me the most is that I walked in there more than once a day, and still didn't even notice him, so I have no idea how long he had been watching me. I've worked 2 night shifts since then, and worked 1 other night. Since then I have been sure to scan the barn and lock the doors while I am feeding. So a note to everyone, not just farmers, always lock your doors. And to that creepy man in one of my calf pens, let's not meet again.
So I worked 2 shifts again this past weekend, and there are certain doors in the barn that I can't lock even if I want to, so I just have to be extra cautious about it. One of those nights, I got there early in hope of maybe getting off before midnight. That being said, I was the only one there for a little bit. I went out to the big barn to get the first pen of milking cows. I just remember feeling uneasy all over. It might have been just me being paranoid given the previous situation. Well, that night I thought someone was lurking in the pasture in which we had the heifers in earlier. I couldn't see because it was dark, but I saw that familiar smile with the little light I had coming from my silos. But I figured I was hallucinating, being a little skittish, so I brushed it off and went into the barn. I almost had the whole first pen to the pillar when my coworker showed up. We continued the night as usual, and then I had to go start the pasteurizer. Of course, I didn't want to, but I had to. I went in there and the calves seemed fine. Everything seemed perfect. I looked around and everything was good. I went back to help milk the second pen. After that pen, I went to feed the calves while my coworker went to get the third pen like usual. Like I said, everything seemed fine. I was probably in there for around 20 minutes feeding the hutch calves, which typically takes longer, and then I went to the far pens where I saw the man the last time and everything was okay. Then I went to feed the middle pens, and that's when something didn't seem right. One of the calves was laying down and refused to get up to eat, so I hopped the fence and helped it. I turned around once. I got the calf up, and there he was. This time he was standing and still smiling. I couldn't really see his face because it was covered, but he was still wearing the same clothes, which was weird because it was 60-something degrees out that night. He wasn't very tall or very big, but just had a really creepy appearance and smile. He didn't say anything, he just smiled. I have a knife on me for work purposes, usually to cut baling twine. I was working with the same girl, and me and her literally locked ourselves into the break room again and called our boss. We got out there and we went to the calf barn again, and everything was just as I left it except one thing. The milk pail that had previously been filled to a mark on it was now empty, and the milk was all over the ground. My other coworkers started reporting things going missing, cows being moved, lights turning on and off, doors being left open, milkers being turned off. One even said that the man was sitting in one of the empty calf hutches, and they didn't realize it was a calf until they went to feed it and he was just smiling at them. The cops had been notified, and we now have a cop parked by the barn every night, and one that stays in the area at all times. I don't know where he was, but this guy really creeps me out, and lately I've been turning down night shifts. The whole thing really just freaks me out, but I hate being afraid to go to work. So to the guy who keeps showing up in my calf barn, please never come back, and let's never ever officially meet.
My story starts 4 years ago, and is still kinda happening. Lucas was the bus driver who drove the kids from my village to school next to town every day. He always was the nice bus driver, as there was a grumpy and moody one who sometimes switched shifts with him. A lot of people thought he was cool and always polite. I was 17 when there was some heavy rain in the afternoon when I was on my way home and I arrived at the station in town. Lucas was already there. As he noticed me, he let me in the bus and we started a conversation. I felt uncomfortable first, but he was always a good talker, so the weird feeling had gone soon. At one point he asked me about my then ex-boyfriend. He saw us together and the two of them used to talk when he was still in school. He was 21 at the time, already working. I told him that we broke up and that it was for the better. Then we continued talking about school. We started to talk every now and then, and after a while he asked me for my phone number so I could maybe text him if I'm late for the bus or I need a ride in general. I found out that he was married, had 3 kids. He claimed to be 33, but later he said over 40. I never really found out how old he actually was. The day after we exchanged numbers, he texted me that he was going to take a bath and said that there would be enough space for 2. I replied that he should ask his wife about that, and he then said, "She is out of town, so I am pretty lonely." We left it at that. One time later, like 2 weeks later, I saw him and a young girl during his break making out. I sent him a message telling him that it's not the way a married man should talk to younger girls. He replied that he had explained to me later his wife didn't want to have sex with him since the birth of his 3rd child. He has multiple young girlfriends all around my age. When I asked him why he wouldn't look for someone closer to his age, he replied, "Girl, you don't know where to find the honey. Girls your age need a proper man, someone who can give it to 'em. Boys that age are no good, but girls are so sweet." We then talked about my ex, who he said was a nice guy, but could have never made me happy. I was a rebellious, moody teen, so I actually never listened to adults. Some things he told me made me think. I couldn't get it out of my head. I started to believe the twisted things he said to me. I thought he was in the right and it would be better for his marriage if he would have little girlfriends. The next day, I had school until the evening. I had to take the last bus home, and because my sleeping schedule was terrible, I fell asleep in the bus. I woke up when the bus was already empty, Lucas standing next to my seat. It was already dark outside, so I had no idea where we were. He sat down, started talking, and kissed me at some point. I asked him to stop, and that I wasn't here to become one of his girlfriends. "Then why did you stay in the bus?" "I canceled someone else for you. You don't want me to be sad, do you?" And for some stupid reason, I believed him. He was the adult. He was in the right. We had sex because he made me feel guilty. I felt terrible afterwards and wanted to stop contact, but he was the one who brought me to school every day, so it was difficult to avoid him. The entire thing went on for months. Him making me feel guilty, giving me compliments, and making me feel worthless at the same time. Showering me in presents and telling me that he invested so much money in me, and it would be rude to say no to him because of that. He wants me. I'm the best he ever had.
I am not allowed to leave. The time I managed to get out of the situation is because of my cat. When I tried to sneak back into my house, she started meowing, and my parents woke up, took my phone, and found the not yet deleted messages from him. They were furious. I was angry and tried to defend him. I did not want him to get in trouble. They made me change my number and read through the phone calls I made, checking that his number wouldn't show up again. I met him again. He forced me to give him my new number, and he texted me with a different one. My father noticed the amount of texts to a new number, but believed me that it was for a school project. I asked Lucas to stop, that it's too dangerous. I met my new boyfriend for a few weeks after that, and managed to end things with Lucas, for now. I changed my number again, but he got it somehow, probably from my ex. I changed it again. A few weeks later, I saw his car in my neighborhood. He did not know where I lived exactly, but he was pretty close to my house. I managed to hide myself. Later, I got a text that he was in my village, hoping to see me. He somehow got my number again. I changed it one last time, and it suddenly stopped. I thought that would be it. Fast forward to May last year. I'm 21, have a different boyfriend who happened to live close to Lucas' house. One day, he saw me. He texted me again, telling me that the same things he did all the time. I was scared. I had no idea how he managed to get my number again. It must have been my ex, who happened to be in the same theater group, but I never actually gave him my number, so he probably asked around and then told Lucas. My boyfriend noticed my reaction, and I finally told someone the whole story. He couldn't understand how I could still defend Lucas. His manipulation was pretty good. I almost gave in and agreed to meet Lucas. The next day, I saw his car in my village a few times, received text from him, and somehow managed to tell him to leave me alone. I moved to another town and blocked him everywhere. It's been since July 2016 that I last heard of him, and I am in therapy now. So, I hope it's the end of the story, and I will never see him again. So a bit of backstory here. Not sure if this matters, but at the time of the incident, about 6 months ago, I was 21. I worked the evening shift and usually make it off around 11:30 p.m. After leaving the parking lot of my job, I take a right, then an immediate left at the light about 300 feet up the road to go home. On this particular night, everything seemed normal. As I pulled up to the red light in the left-hand turning lane, this intersection is a block away from my very large university, so it is usually pretty busy. This night was no different, and I wasn't the only car waiting at the light. There were 2 turning lanes, and there was a car directly to my right, also waiting for the light. As this light tends to be a particularly long one, I began browsing through various apps on my phone. I suddenly hear a familiar sound from the rear passenger side of my car, that little thump when someone pulls the handle of the door. I immediately whip my head around to see a man peering into my window, still attempting to open my locked door with a wide grin on his face. He appeared to be in his mid to late 30s, was balding and wearing a tattered wife-beater tank top. Sorry for the crude name, I just don't know what else they call it. His teeth were cracked and yellow, apparently from drug use. I immediately stomped on the accelerator and run the red light. I see him in the rear view mirror, just standing there, staring at my car. I called my best friend, who I also happened to work with. She was working the night shift from 11 to 7, and I told her to inform our supervisor. The supervisor called the police, who then ended up contacting me for a statement. I described the man as best as I could, but I only saw him for a few seconds. I never heard back, so I'm assuming he was never found. After this, I never leave work without walking out with one of the other girls. I am so grateful that my car doors automatically lock when the car is put in drive. Otherwise, he might have actually gotten in. The thing that still bothers me is that I know there was another car right next to me. They had to have seen what was happening, maybe even saw the guy walk up, but made no attempt to help me.
My apartment complex is a nice, well-maintained building surrounded by beaten-down, high-crime neighborhoods. My apartment complex has gates surrounding them that can only be opened by a member or calling a resident and having them manually let you in. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible for trespassers to find their way inside the gates. One night, at about 10 or 11 p.m., I pulled into my apartment after spending time at my fiance's. My roommate had taken the parking spot in front of our building, so I was forced to park off to the side of the building in an uncovered spot. It was a short walk to the apartments, but when I got out of my car, I realized that the lights in front of my apartment building were turned off. The building across from the building still had their front lights on, so I figured that the bulbs were being replaced at 11 p.m. I was lucky that the lights from the other building illuminated parts of the pathway to my apartment, but my anxiety flared up and my imagination began to run wild. I pictured masked murderers jumping from the shadows and whisking me away to a secondary location. My keys found their way between my knuckles as I created a makeshift weapon against the creatures that go bump in the night. I was also wrapped up in my own nightmares as I power walked to my building that I didn't realize someone was standing in front of me until I was almost on top of him. His back was turned towards me, and he had his head down. I thought he was lighting a cigarette, and that was the reason for his strange pose. When I took a step closer, his head flipped around, and he was staring at me as though I was a ghost. He was wide-eyed and looked like an animal caught in a trap facing a hunter. I internally jumped, but I did my best to maintain my composure. My apartment complex is very small, and I had made sure to learn the faces of my neighbors. I didn't recognize this man as living in the complex, and he seemed as though he was homeless. His hair was long and unruly, and he had a beard with bits of matter clinging to the scraggly hair. His clothes were obviously worn, and he was wearing a jacket too big for him and too heavy for the Arizona weather. I continued walking, my grip tightening around the keys in my hand, just in case. I neared the staircase that led to my apartment and turned back when I felt eyes burrowing into me. The man stood there. I had left him a few yards away, but he had twisted his body so that his arms were frozen above his head, and one of his legs looked as though he was about to jump away. The whole contorted look made him look as though he was dancing the Running Man, but he was completely frozen with his eyes glued to me as I moved for the stairs. We stood staring at each other. He looked like a screenshot of a 90s dancer, and I'm sure I looked like a drowned rat. I squeaked out an apology for interrupting him and ran up the stairs and into my apartment. I stood by my door, looking out the peephole to see if he had followed me, one hand holding my cell phone with 911 ready and the other wrapped around the baseball bat my fiancé had left me after the previous encounter at my complex. Thankfully, he didn't go up the stairs, and as I left with nothing but a bizarre story to retell, I did end up calling the apartment complex's manager, and he informed me that the security officer was on his way to investigate.
One day we started the chat on Twitter. Can't remember how it started, but we kinda just got along. I was the type of girl who sometimes went flirty with guys without any sexual attraction. I did that just because I could, so it wasn't weird that I became flirty every now and then with him. One day he asked me to hang out, but I wasn't the type of person who liked to go out, especially with a guy I wasn't that close to, so I made excuses. He kept responding to every tweet I made, even though I wasn't responding. This gave me red flags, and I tried as best as I could to slowly cut off any contact from him. Sometimes he messaged me, which I quickly deleted without reading his messages because they were just weird. A few months later, my roommate, her friend, and I went out for dinner in a small diner near our house. We were just talking while eating when out of nowhere Daniel showed up and sat at a table in front of ours. He stared at me and I remember thinking that was fucking awkward. But I played it cool and said hi to him from my table and asked if he was coming alone. He said his roommates weren't home, so he decided to eat out alone. Then, jokingly, I told him to get a girlfriend so he wouldn't have to eat alone anymore, and he laughed. He then flat out told me, "Nah, I want to have dinner with you." I just laughed it off and finished my dinner quickly, and asked my friends to head back home, and said goodbye to Daniel. When we were home, I went to my room and checked my phone. I left my phone at home earlier. I never touched my phone while eating. We left the diner around 7 p.m., and I got this message from him stamped a little after 7 saying, "I want to have dinner with you." That was it. He officially just hit another level of creepiness, and I blocked him on every social media. Fast forward to 2 weeks later, I told a high school friend of mine about the incident with Daniel. She told me that back in high school, Daniel did the exact same thing to her and a few other girls, lots of juniors. Turned out every girl knew he was a creep. Now when I think about it, I just remember a middle school friend who was Daniel's neighbor had told me about Daniel chasing her and freaking her out when they were like in 8th grade or something.
So this happened around a year ago. I was living in a large city in the UK, around a mile from the center. Although the area I lived in was nice, the city itself had a lot of crime. I had just finished my university class and was waiting at the bus stop, and I'm helping a woman locate her bus on the timetable, and as I'm helping her, my bus pulls up and drives away. Great. A man must have seen the whole thing happen because he comes over to me and says something along the lines of, "Tough luck, that's annoying." And I reply, "Yeah, typical." Trying to be polite to him, shortly after the next bus comes along, I get on, and so does the man I was just talking to, which I found weird as he could have got the earlier bus I missed. Whatever, I don't really think much of it, and I put my earphones in and continue on the 20-minute journey home. I get off the bus at my normal stop and I'm walking along when suddenly I feel someone grab my shoulder. I flinch and instantly push the hand away and look behind me, and it's the man from before. I take my headphones out and he says, "Hey, beautiful, you got a man?" My defenses immediately go up, as I'm sure any girl living in a city will understand. I start walking and he follows me. I'm pretty bewildered at this point. I have experienced creepers before, but not someone physically grabbing me. Nah, you're just saying that. I can tell you're lying. Come on, beautiful. Can I have your number? No, I have a boyfriend. I actually wasn't lying. I did have a boyfriend, he continues asking over and over again, getting angrier and angrier at me. No, sorry. At this point I start walking really fast. Also jogging. He's still following me. It's about a 5-minute walk to my flat, and he followed me the whole way back. I honestly think at this point I'm going to get attacked or stabbed. I don't know what. I've never been in this situation before, probably due to the fact I'm 5'11", even though I only weigh 130 pounds. I've been told I look intimidating due to my height. So I get back to my flat and he's followed me all the way to the doors. Luckily, I get in and shut the doors just before he goes up to my flat. Around 30 minutes later, I go out to my balcony and look down and he's still there. I contemplate calling the police, but instead call my concierge, and they go out, and I can hear them threatening to call the police if he doesn't leave. Thankfully, he does. I spend the rest of my months living there worried he was going to show up, and luckily he did not. My stomach turned recently. I heard on the news that not 5 minutes from where I used to live, and this all took place, a girl was walking home late at night and she got assaulted. She flagged a car down for help and got assaulted again by a different guy. I can't imagine the horror this poor girl went through. Honestly, look into getting self-defense classes or something, especially if you live in a city. I'd really love to have karate chopped the guy in the dick. But seriously, I was lucky. It could have ended a lot worse. I have no idea what this guy's intentions were. If he just wanted my number or had something more sinister in mind, be wary with who you speak. I find with men harassing women in the street, if you completely ignore them, more often than not they will stop. If they don't, or they are getting physical, a loud noise will startle them so you can run away. Also, don't feel like you have to answer to a person who is talking to you just to be polite in a situation like this. You don't owe them politeness. Your safety is more important. This happened on December 21st, 2016. I am a 21-year-old Canadian girl, 19 at the time. At this time in my life, I was pretty desperate for attention, and so I went on a lot of bad dates and put myself in a lot of bad situations. When this pretty cute guy started hitting on me, I was pretty flattered and agreed to do some mushrooms at his place and to get to know each other better. I'm not going to go into details, but let's just say that it was a really bad idea, so I ended up leaving his place around midnight, high as fuck, with a long and cold walk to the train station. It really didn't bother me, though. To be honest, I was just happy to be out of that situation. And on my way home, I also really enjoyed the cold, and had done mushrooms many times by this point, and was really enjoying the walk. It was just a straight walk in mostly residential streets until you came into a busier street that leads to downtown. It separates the residential streets from the mall that I worked at the time, and a Wendy's that was closer to the lights, where I had to cross. Just beyond the mall is the train station. You have to walk either through the mall parking lot or through a field where the old high school used to be to get to the train station. So I got to the lights and was waiting to cross. However, it was quite late and the lights were taking what felt like forever to change. That's when a big blue pickup truck came driving down the road away from downtown. It slowed right down as it passed by me before speeding off. I probably should have sensed some danger, but my high ass was worried that he slowed down to let me pass, and when I didn't, he left, making me think that the light wasn't going to change. I then noticed that the same blue truck had pulled around the block and was sitting in the parking lot at the closed Wendy's. Now I realized that something was wrong. The light finally changed and I walked across the street. I planned on just walking past it and going through the mall parking lot to get to the train. I kept my head down as I walked. The man in the truck yelled something at me as I walked past. I looked up, and in my state I thought it was a regular customer of mine as I worked at the mall. I raised my arms in the air like, "Fuck, you got me." But as I approached the truck, I realized how wrong I was. This was a completely different person, and I was now at the side of his truck in an abandoned Wendy's parking lot. I just stared at him. I could feel someone staring at me from the back seat of the truck, right behind the driver's seat, but there was no one in the front passenger seat. The driver smiled and asked me things straight out of the PSA, things like, "What part of the city do you live in? And do you live alone?" I was being polite and actually answered his questions truthfully, because for some reason I thought he was a cop. I mean, that has to be why he is questioning me. He obviously knew I was high and was trying to make sure I got home safe, right? Wrong. In a matter of maybe 5 minutes, he knew what part of the city I lived in, that I lived with my dad, and that I planned on taking the train home. It wasn't until that he straight up asked for directions to my house that I played dumb and said I didn't know. He kind of raised his eyebrows at me and said,
"So you don't know where you live?"
I kind of laughed and was like, "Nope, I guess not." And I walked around to the back of his truck, headed for the field to get to the train station, and he pulled away. I had to cross a small street to get to the field. I noticed further down the street with the truck parked facing me and looked at it. It inched forward a little bit to make it seem like he was leaving. I turned around and kept walking. I turned around a few seconds later to see the truck is still there. I put my arms in the air and yelled, "I fucking see you!" He then drove off as he was going to circle the mall. I ran into the field and pulled out my phone and dialed 911 and paused before pressing call. I was clearly high on drugs, and there was a good chance that I wouldn't be taken seriously. I was also worried that I was going to have to take the cops back to the guy's house as it had been where I got the drugs from, so instead I called my dad. By the time he picked up the phone, I was crying. I explained to him what was happening, and he said to get somewhere safe and call a cab. If I had been smart, I would have taken the train a couple of steps in the wrong direction, and then called a cab. I didn't. Instead, I went to the train station that he knew I was going to be at and called the cab. I waited for 20 minutes. I kept peeking out to see if he was there, but I didn't see him. My cab arrived, and I got in and told the cab where to go. I was looking behind us the whole time. Just before we made it to downtown, I noticed that a large truck was behind us, but I couldn't see the color until we turned, and the truck turned behind us. It was, of course, blue. I started freaking out, and I begged for the cab to pull over. He did so reluctantly, and the blue truck slowly rolled by and then turned the corner, like he was going to drive back around the block. I yelled at the driver to start going again, and he did so, very annoyed. I finally did make it back home and collapsed on the bed in tears. I didn't leave my house for 2 days, terrified that he was driving around my neighborhood looking for me. I did see him and his truck one more time, but it's not really worth mentioning. Please be safe, people. There are so many things that I could have done to prevent this from happening, but I was too high and dumb to think straight. I used to deliver packages in the mail for a company in the South. A lot of the daily routes were in the hills and woods. Last year, I had a route that was super deep country. I was used to back roads in the country now. At this job, by this point, there's some houses I stop at where the driveway is super steep or some other shit. But for the most part, everyone was always super friendly out there, country folk. Well, I had a delivery that was going to this long gravel street. There was only a few houses on my journey to the house that my delivery was. Still, at this point, I'm totally fine. There's a ton of these types of roads out here. Well, I arrive at my destination, no mailbox, no driveway, no gravel. You can make out a little bit of a path that has been made from cars driving to the house. The driveway is maybe 250 yards long, with the house at the end of it. I'm only sketched out because I'm in the woods and land is super unpredictable back here, meaning you never know when there's just a drop-off. I'm in a huge box truck, so if one tire was to slip off the side, the whole thing is going down. So I'm driving literally less than a mile an hour, taking my time, being extremely cautious. I walk up to the front door of this cabin thing, and the front door had a large glass window on it. Not modern, think old, like a cabin that was built in the late 50s and no repairs. As I sit the small package down in front of the door, I glance inside the house. The main room, which would be like the living room, I'm guessing, is completely empty. The only thing that is in this room is 2 foldable metal chairs, both facing the corner of the room, but nothing is in the corner. In the meantime, I'm trying to do my job with my right hand, where I keep making very quick glances inside. From what I saw, there was nothing in that house. It was a shell. The kitchen may have had old appliances in it, but I wasn't really paying attention to that part. Fuck the driveway. I back out of this driveway while checking my surroundings everywhere. I make it back onto the road as I'm driving down the road, maybe 40 feet away from this dude's entrance of the driveway. There's a trash bag in the middle of the street. It's opened just a little bit. I slow down and it looks like there's a woman's sweater or something in there. Was that a kill room? Was someone or multiple people held hostage on that property? Something was up. Immediately, I contacted my buddy and told him about it. He suggested I go back and snap a few pictures. I agreed. About 5 minutes go by, and I make it back to the address, and the trash bag is completely gone. I looked everywhere, on the street and the side of the street. Completely gone. But get this, I always thought about how I never know what I'm delivering, or who I am delivering to. When I first landed this job, I remember thinking how crazy it would be if someone was holding people hostage in their house, torturing them, and ordered their food and house supplies online because they were afraid of leaving the house with the kidnapped people alone. That's all I could think about when dropping off this package. I left that job not even a week later for different reasons, but I did tell my boss, and he assured me that he could contact the local police department and take the house off our normal route schedule, and never heard anything back about it. I'm aware that if the police went out there and found something or people, I would immediately be called in to tell them what I saw. So I'm going to assume that they went out to check it out and found nothing. But in the same sense, it makes me wonder about the trash bag immediately disappearing after I left. Did they realize that they messed up and I was going to say something, so they prepared for that? I don't know. I also have no clue what the address was or how to get there by memory to check it out myself, but I think about that very often, and every single time I do, I get chills down my spine just because of the thought of the unknown. Back when I was a kid, my mom and I had a deal. She'd schedule all my scarier appointments, like dentist visits and vaccines, in the morning, and if I went without whining or fussing too much, I'd get to play hooky for the rest of the school day, and we'd get lunch, go to the mall, and see a movie. This was one of those days. It was a few weeks before Christmas, but the mall was pretty much quiet because it was around 1 p.m. on a weekend. I'd had my picture taken with Santa. We did some Christmas shopping and had lunch at my favorite restaurant, and we were going to finish off our day with whatever kid's Christmas movie was playing at the time. I don't remember which one it was, but I remember how fun and pleasant the day had been. The theater was pretty much almost empty. Just my mom and I, and a few parents with kids too young to be in school. A few minutes later, a single man walked in. I remember him entering because I thought it was weird that he didn't have any kids with him, and because he seemed to spend a long time surveying the theater, the way people do when they are trying to find a seat or two in a crowded auditorium. I remember him staring at me for quite a while, but then he sat down near the door, and I didn't think too much about it. A girl I played with in my neighborhood had really strict parents, and they always went to see kids' movies alone first to be sure they approved of them. Maybe his kids went to school with me, and he recognized me, and that was why his eyes had lingered. Just as the previews had started, I realized I needed to pee. I had just turned 8 years old a few months earlier, and my mom was finally letting me do things like that without her accompanying me. As I got up to go, my mom slipped me $10 and told me to get some candy and soda, a real treat in my house. I was so excited to be trusted to go by myself and to get candy that I almost didn't notice when the man from earlier got up and followed closely behind me as I left the theater. Almost as I was allowed to do things myself more, my parents had drilled into me that I always needed to be aware of my surroundings and anything that felt off, and the way he bolted from his seat to follow me out of the theater felt off. To give a little context, the movie theater was attached to the mall, so the main entrance was through the mall itself. To make getting out a little easier, there were a few exit-only doors that led to the parking lot. The restrooms were right next to these. The man followed me all the way to the women's bathroom, not close enough to immediately spook me if I hadn't noticed him, but close enough that any passerby would assume he was a father trailing behind his daughter. After I got to the restroom, I peeked out. He'd stationed himself just outside the entrance to the bathroom on the side closest to the exit. I told myself that maybe he needed to use the bathroom too, but clearly he didn't, so I peed, and then I waited and waited. I heard a man's voice just outside joke with someone about how he was waiting for his daughter. I knew my mom wouldn't get worried and come look for me immediately because she would assume I was in line to get snacks, but I couldn't get back to her without going past the man. Finally, a nice-looking older woman came in. As she was leaving, I told her I'd forgotten how to get back to the theater where my mom was waiting, and could she walk me there. I held her hand tightly as she carefully told me she was glad to help. As we left, the man waiting took a quick step forward, like he had been waiting to grab me. When he saw that I was with the woman, he turned around and left out the exit door. I made it back to my mom without incident. I told her I didn't see any candy that I wanted, and I was kind of full from lunch anyway. In hindsight, I should have told her right away about the creepy guy who followed me, but I was afraid that I'd lose my precious new independence. But looking back as an adult, I still can't figure out any benign intentions that would explain his actions, and I desperately hope that he didn't catch some other little girl unaware. I am a 21-year-old senior in college living with 3 other girls in an old story house. We are located about 15 minutes a walk from main campus, and the majority of our neighbors are college students. That being said, this town is notorious for being a little, well, sketchy. Millie is home to one of the first insane asylums built in America. After the majority of it being closed down, abandoned for years, the final building was shut down about a month ago, and the remaining patients were released. Now, I doubt this is directly correlated with my creepy experience, but I am not the only one who has interesting encounters with strangers since their release in this town. 2 nights ago, after getting off work around 11:30, I came home to my roommates getting ready to go out for a night out. I realized how stupid it was, but we often had an open door policy, free for anyone to come over and visit as they please. We would lock the door at night, but the one time we forgot really came to bite us in the ass. Around midnight, I was hopping in the shower as my roommates were headed out the door. We said our goodbyes, and I told them I would be meeting up with them later. I had just stepped out of the shower when I heard what sounded like the front door slamming shut. I automatically assumed one of the girls had forgotten something, so I call out their names. No response. I then hear footsteps in the hallway. I call out again. No response. Fear and dread came over me, and I immediately grabbed my clothes and ran into my bedroom. I threw my clothes on, leaned my ear to the door, and waited in silence to hear if someone was in the house. I hear nothing. I decided that it must have been one of my roommates grabbing something and leaving again, so I head into the living room to get my phone. 6 missed calls, and it's still ringing. My roommate, Carrie, was on the other end. I answered and immediately could hear the panic in her voice. "Lee, are you in the house?" Me. "Yeah, Carrie, why?" "You need to get out. Sam drove by and said a man saw us walking through the front door. He called the police, but you need to leave." I shit my pants. Nothing was going through my head besides more adrenaline and fear. I wasn't sure of the man's intentions, but I sure wasn't going to wait to find out. While remaining on the phone with my roommate, I bolted out the front door and hid behind my car. I watched the house from afar, waiting anxiously to see any movement. My thought process was not at its finest at that point, and I realized I probably could have made smarter decisions. As my friend approached in a truck, I sprinted out from behind my car and jumped in the back of their truck. Just as I did, a dark figure scurried out into the woods, running in the opposite direction. I can only assume he had been inching closer to us as I was waiting for them to arrive. I screamed bloody murder, and we floored it out of there. I refused to go back into that house until the police arrived, and it had been triple checked. There were no signs of anything being touched or stolen, which makes me wonder what the man's intentions were. You can guarantee that I've locked my door every night since, and to the stranger who walked into my house while I was in the shower, let's not meet again.
Recently, I moved to an island in the South Pacific and had gotten the hiking bug, so I try to go out to the new locations as much as I possibly can. This happened about 2 weeks ago. Since I live in the South Pacific region, it gets pretty hot, driving all by the most insane hikers indoors, unless it's at night. Of course, I'm not a masochist, so I try to do all my hiking in the early hours of the morning or in the evening when it starts to get cooler. I've never been afraid of going hiking by myself. I did it when I lived in Oregon and never ran into any problems with it. But my island isn't my friendly home state. I always carry pepper spray. I got to the trailhead at about 6:30 in the evening. It was mostly just a straight walk down to the cliff and then a grueling journey back up. I didn't want to go, but my dog, Mad Moxie, needed to be walked, and I had done the hike so many times I could probably do it in my sleep. The first thing I noticed when I pulled up, an old rusty out blue pickup truck with a big plastic tarp over it, over the bed to keep out the rain. These are pretty common on this island, affectionately earning them the name. These are pretty common on the island. I didn't think much of it as I hooked up Moxie and started heading down to the trail, trying my best to ignore the mosquitoes that were making a meal out of my exposed neck. Heading down the trail was relatively easy, avoiding the banana spider webs. I felt the stress of my day slowly unwind as the underbrush grew darker and the night approached. I made it all the way down to the water's edge when I noticed a man standing about 100 yards away. It was dark enough now that I could only see his silhouette, so I have no idea if he was looking at me or at the water, but I choose to ignore him, and instead, after some time, the man started walking over to me and stopped, maybe about 10 feet away. "Evening," I greeted as he nodded and looked down at Moxie, who had just returned from running after the ball. I stooped down to pet her on her head as the man kept his eyes on my dog. "Can I help you, sir?" "Pretty dog," he responded mildly. "You are alone?" "I have my dog," I said lamely, trying to sound braver than I was feeling. "I'm never alone." I tried to emphasize on the fact that I had my dog with me, but the man seemed unfazed by my statement. "Oh, have a good night." With that, he turned around and started walking back towards the trailhead. I watched his shadow disappear into the trees and waited for about half an hour before I too started walking back towards the path, my mind on high alert. The crickets pierced the night as I climbed the steps, illuminated by my flashlight. My hands were full of Moxie's leash. Finally, my light pierced the trees. When I got to the top, I nearly shat myself. The rusted blue pickup was sitting in the parking lot still, but their passenger side door was practically touching my car's driver's side. Inside the car, I could faintly see two men sitting in the cab, and I could feel them watching me. Slowly, I approached my car, walking as far over to the passenger side as I could, and kept Moxie with me as close as I opened the door and crawled over to the driver's side. At the moment, the door of the pickup truck flew open, and my dog started going apeshit, barking at the two people who were now outside their car and trying to break into mine. Heart in chest, I rammed the keys into the ignition and tore out of the parking lot so quickly I nearly took my mirror off. I called my mom as soon as I got home, and she begged me to call the police. Unfortunately, the police here on this island aren't as vigilant as they are on the mainland. Earlier this month, another girl actually disappeared from that area without a trace, and it makes me wonder if the men in the blue pickup truck had something to do with it. If I hadn't had Moxie with me, would I have been mugged or worse? If I learned anything from this experience, it's that please always take pepper spray with you. Go hiking in groups and always let someone know where you are going. It might save your life someday. And to the men in the pickup truck, let's never meet again. When I was 17 years old, I was intrigued by computers and everything the internet had to offer. I soon found out about Yahoo chat rooms, back when they were used primarily. I would talk to a few people on there, including a friend I made which became a friend in real life even to this day. So I didn't think anything bad would happen to me. No one ever thinks that, especially on the internet. I met this one guy named Daniel. At the time, he was 28 years old. Him and I became friends very quick, and I felt like I could tell him anything like I knew him forever. Our conversation would last forever, and I ended up telling him more than I probably should ever tell anyone. One of the conversations I had mentioned that I was trying to go to school to become a computer engineer and was trying to find a job in the field to better suit my understandings. He then told me he had his own computer company and that he was trying to find some help. As a naive woman who was trying to find work in her field, I wanted to take the offer. I talked to my family members about it, and despite their reasoning, I took the job offer. I will be the first to admit that my family were not strict at all. My mom did not like the idea, but she said that I was going to do it anyways, and that at least she knew where I was going. I probably would have been more grateful if she would have put her foot down. The job was located in New Jersey, and I lived in Texas. Fast forward to about 6 months later. This was when things went from good to worse. He was still trying to get his business off the ground, but kinda started slacking at it. To make extra income, I would help others that needed it with their networking and their computers. It was a way to get out of the house since I was not allowed to leave the house without his knowledge or consent. I just figured he was protecting me since I was still unfamiliar with the city. Once I turned 18 years old, things started to get even worse out of nowhere, when he would tell me how to eat my food and to be a proper lady. He would yell at me if I accidentally scraped my fork against my teeth and little things like that. He would hack into my laptop to keep an eye on me and see who I was talking to and what I was doing. Every time my family members would call me, I had to talk to them in front of him. Things started getting so bad that I started staying at work longer hours just so I didn't have to go home. I would never mention this to my coworkers because I didn't want them to pry into my business. It wasn't until later that they found out on their own. One of my coworkers has a huge crush on me and always worried about me when it was time to go home. He knew that I would rather work a double shift than go home, and that made him worried. I honestly wish I stayed in contact with him. He was one of the best friends a girl could ask for. I started getting into MMORPG games since they took me out of the reality I was living in at the moment. I met this guy on there, and it made me feel good to have someone to talk to finally. I never meant anything by it. It was just an escape. Daniel found out about the stuff I would say to him and said that I was cheating on him, which I never did such a thing. Until this moment, I never believed that he would go psychotic on me or even hurt me. I figured he would just yell at me and try to scare me. One day he got so fed up with all of it and grabbed my cell phone and broke it in half. He looked at me and said, "Now you have no way to tell your family what you did to me." I was literally terrified at this point. He threatened me a little more, and I started crying. I figured that was the end of it, but I was completely wrong. The next day, I packed a small bag and told him that my job would allow me to do some book work while it was slow. It was a bag of some clothes I could find in a hurry. I got to work and told my coworkers what was going on. They gave me a phone and I called my grandfather, who got me a flight to Texas as soon as he could. I was so grateful for him and everyone at work. When I got to the airport in Texas, I was greeted by my family members. I called Daniel and told him that I was in Texas and I didn't want to be with him anymore. He laughed and said, "There is no way you could have got back to Texas that fast. Come home, now." I assured him that I was not coming back to him. My mom got on the phone and told him the same. I don't know what him and my mom were talking about, but she got very angry and told him to never speak to me again and hung up. I wish I could say that that was the last time I ever spoke to Daniel, but it wasn't. My mom got a new phone to replace the one that Daniel had broken, and somehow Daniel got my number. He would call and threaten me. One time he called and my mom answered and put it on speaker. He said, "You better put her on a fucking plane back to New Jersey or I will come down there and get her myself." I almost had tears in my eyes even thousands of miles away. He still terrified me. My mom replied, "I will wait for you to come and get her. There is a body bag with your name on it." After that, the calls became less and he wasn't harassing me as much anymore. It took about 2 months for him to finally stop calling me, and I was able to move on with my life. I do not talk to people the same way I used to anymore, and I watch what I say to anyone now.
I live in a town in California. I can't tell you guys which one because I don't know if I'll regret it or not later. However, I can describe it. We are a very clean town, as in we never have any serious crime happen here, like murder or something awful that would land us in breaking news. However, when this happened, we for some reason didn't get on, even though it's a big deal. Everyone in my neighborhood know each other and genuinely trust each other, so when the house next door told my family that they would be out of town for a couple of weeks and wanted us to watch over their house while they were gone, it wasn't weird. They also gave us spare keys since they have pets in the house and they couldn't take them on their trip. They have a boxer and 2 rabbits and wanted us to feed them while they were gone, so they give us the keys and head off the next day. One of us would go over to the house and feed the pets and then leave. However, on the day that they said they would be back, they didn't. Me and my family assumed that something had happened to their car and they needed time to fix it. Rare, but it happens. The very next day, we find that they weren't back yet. Start to get a bit concerned, so my dad texts the neighbor's dad. Their dad and my dad are friends. But he doesn't get a reply. The next day, still not back. Soon the other people in the neighborhood start noticing that they haven't came back yet. At this point, someone gets the authorities involved. They question people in the neighborhood, like where they said they were going, what car they were last seen driving in, and if any contact was made. Of course, as I mentioned, with my dad trying to text one of them but not getting anything. I remember they said that they were going over to Florida for a boating trip. I don't remember where, but they said that they were going to Florida. A search party was made both here and over in Florida. Days go by and nothing shows up. While this is happening, you would think the news would be all over this, but no one comes over to report. Because of this, I have no clue where they are, and if anything new has shown up. They went on a trip in the summer in August, and now it's winter in January. I have a bad feeling that this isn't going to end well. Either they are found, either dead or alive, or they are never coming back. But I also feel like there's something bigger to this, like weird stuff is about to happen. If anyone has any ideas to what happened, or if this has reached news somewhere, please let me know. My sister had been dating this guy for 3 years. She told me that in 8th grade he stalked her, just staring at her in the halls and asking about her schedule. I met him about a week after she told me this story. He seemed nice at the time. We talked a bit and then he asked me if I wanted to play Call of Duty. We played for about an hour and had some laughs. I didn't find anything off-putting. He seemed to be a generally nice guy. However, that was 3 years ago, and these past years he has been getting weirder and weirder, and more obsessive. As in, he would constantly call my sister to ask what she was doing and filled her phone with hundreds of texts when she didn't reply immediately. They had multiple breakups and arguments over these years. Just a few days ago, my sister's friend came to us hysterical, stating that he had threatened her life. But they are still together to this day. She also stated he probably had bugged my sister's car and phone because he knows all the texts she has sent and showed up at her house when my sister's car was parked in the driveway. He did not even know where she lived. I am convinced, too, that her car is being traced. He even managed to track us down when we were with my grandparents on vacation. This all changed about 2 days before our vacation to California. I'm one of those people who stay up really late at night, even though it's a school day the next morning. I usually just binge watch videos on my computer while laying in bed. It was about 12 midnight on a Saturday when I heard a faint screech. The sound sounded vague and distant. Then I heard a soft sound on my garage door opening. I assumed it was my sister coming home late, like my dad predicted. He left the garage door unlocked because he expected her to come home late. I heard smooth and soft footsteps walking up the wooden stairs, and then a shallow grunt. The footsteps slowly moved throughout the upstairs while I paused my video and sat up in fear. My sister would usually not care about being so quiet and went straight to the bathroom to take off her makeup. The soft footsteps ensued. I would now like to mention that I do have a lock on my door. I convinced my dad to get me one 2 years ago because I am paranoid about someone attacking me by simply opening the unlocked door. I could hear the floorboards creak as the footsteps neared my door. I heard a hand graze the frame of my door and grasp the knob tightly. I held my breath, and my hand started to reach towards the wooden baseball bat I had under my bed. The doorknob turned slightly, but the lock restricted it from turning all the way. The intruder on the other side jiggled it a bit and seized. I grabbed my baseball bat and gradually made my way towards my door. I saw 2 gray shoes inches away from my door. I raised my bat defensively, ready to whack whoever picked the lock or busted down my door. The shoes slowly turned and strided away from my door. My sister's door opened, and a few moments later, I heard footsteps exiting and steadily walked down the creaking and protesting stairs. I dropped my bat to my waist and walked back to my bed. I pulled a chair to barricade my door, just in case, and breathed silently to calm down. My phone was out of battery, so I couldn't call the police, and my mom and dad were on the other side of the house. I would make a mad dash for my parents' room, or I could just scream at the top of my lungs and hope that they wake up before the intruder gets to me. It may also scare him off by me alerting my parents. So I screamed. About a minute later, I heard heavy footsteps rushing over and unlocking my door. My dad opened the door with a look of complete concern and dread. He asked me if I was okay, and I told him there was someone in the house. He grabbed my bat and hurried downstairs. He came back up a few minutes later after checking all the closets and general hiding places. He ordered me to go back to bed and lock my door. I was wide awake for half an hour, but eventually, somehow dozed off. I woke up to find my dad talking to my mom in the hallway. He told me the garage was pried open with some kind of rusty tool or crowbar. The intruder had left a note in my sister's room saying he didn't know where she was and that he missed her. I knew immediately that it was her boyfriend. What disturbed me the most was when I looked at my phone. It had a new message. I had wrote a message to a number I have never seen before. Late at night. The only problem was I hadn't texted anyone last night. And there was a response. It read, "Merry Christmas." There's one problem with this. I haven't sent a message to anyone with this number in my life. And my phone, it was in my room last night. This happened years ago, but still affects me to this day. The summer after I graduated high school, I was still living at home. I was up late one night and was packing for a camping trip with my friends. It was unbelievably hot and had the window open as I sat and folded clothes. It was around 2 in the morning, and the next thing I knew, there was a hand coming through the gap in the screen of my window. I screamed, and the hand flew back. I was stunned, but there was a part of me that wondered if it was my younger brother pranking me. I got up and looked out the window and just saw the figure of a man staring back at me. I ran into my brother's room, and he was there playing video games. We called the police, who came and searched the area. They found nothing, warned me and my parents to lock the windows and doors, and left. We were all still shaken up, and my mom had a feeling that he would come back. It turns out our mother's intuition was right. She went outside and waited on our back porch. After 20 minutes or so, she saw a man, dressed in black, slink into the backyard along the tree line. He hid behind a tree for a few seconds and ran to the other tree and hid there, slowly working his way toward my window. My mother yelled something to him, and he took off running. The police came back out, and again, found no trace of him. I opened the window again, not even the curtains. My parents installed some motion detecting lights, and that seemed to be the end of that. About 6 months later, my friend and I got an apartment downtown together. We were really excited. This was our first place on our own. The apartment wasn't exactly the best quality, but it was so fun to be living in the city. The downside was that it was street parking only. After a few weeks, my car was broken into. Nothing was taken but a single rose sat on the passenger seat. It was creepy, but I vowed to be vigilant and safe. I always tried to park close to the entrance, near the lights. But often it was difficult to get those spots, and I would often have to park further away on darker streets. Things quickly began escalating at this point. My car was broken into at least once a week. Most of the time, a flower was left, but once a pair of men's underwear was left. And even more creepily, once a bag of Tootsie Rolls, as they were my favorite candy. This made me wonder if the person knew me personally, and I started to become suspicious of everyone. There was laundry in the basement of the apartment, and one day I went down to get a load that finished drying. As I started to fold, I realized all of my undergarments, bras, and panties were gone. Another week, and I had a male friend over from high school, and his tires got slashed during the visit. By the time the first letter arrived, I had already started making plans to move elsewhere. The letter described a love for me that had been going on for years. He noted things that proved he had been watching me closely. I was able to arrange for another friend to take over my lease and moved in with another friend on the other side of the city. It was a secure building and had an underground parking garage that was only accessible to tenants. I felt much more secure, and the extra money spent was well worth the peace of mind. Things were quiet for a few months, and then my roommate got a boyfriend. Most of us were weary of Ashley's new boyfriend from the beginning. For one, they met on MySpace after he reached out to her. Another reason was that new boyfriend, Matt, was extremely good-looking. And while Ashley was a wonderful person, she just wasn't the type you would typically expect someone like him to date. Ashley was thrilled. She had never had a boyfriend and really felt like he was a Prince Charming. I thought he was weird and creepy from the beginning. Matt was on the quiet side and always seemed to be sporting an uncomfortable, lingering smile. It was difficult to carry on any sort of conversation with him because he would always make it weird with some random facts that were completely unrelated to what we were talking about. I had deleted my MySpace when the initial stalking began, but I created a dummy account to learn more about Matt. It didn't look like he really knew any of his friends in real life. There was only pictures of himself, and the rest of the information was vague. My friends and I gently tried to discourage her from seeing Matt. He technically hadn't done anything wrong, but he was just so strange. She would immediately get defensive and would shut the conversation down. Matt started to spend more time at the apartment, and I found myself finding any excuse I could to avoid coming home. One day, I came home from work and found Matt on my couch alone, drinking a beer. Ashley had been called into work, and she told him he could just hang out. I was furious because I didn't want to spend any time with him, so I grabbed a beer and a snack and headed off to my room and shut the door. About 30 minutes or so, he knocked on my door and suggested we watch some TV and get to know each other better because we both loved Ashley. I didn't want to, but decided that maybe I needed to give it a try. He put on a movie, and I tried to just focus on the movie because I didn't want to talk. At one point, I glanced over to Matt, and he was staring at me with a smile on his face. I snapped a "what" at him, and he just continued smiling and said, "I just can't believe it." "Believe what?" I asked. He said nothing and went back to watching the movie, still smiling. I had no idea what he was talking about, but the interaction had every hair standing up on my body. I excused myself and locked the door to my room. Another month or so went on, and I had managed to avoid being home for much anything beyond sleep and showering. Matt practically lived there and had even brought a bunch of his things to Ashley's room. I really didn't want to move again, but was beginning to look for other options. On their 6-month anniversary, I saw a huge banquet of flowers on the table, and an already opened card popped up next to it. I rolled my eyes and was about to leave when I decided to see what the weirdo wrote to her. When I opened the card, my heart started beating through my chest. The handwriting was exactly the same as the one my stalker had sent. I kept them as evidence and dug them out of my desk for comparison. The handwriting was unique and identical. Matt was the stalker. I called the police first. As they were on their way, I called Ashley and asked her to come over. She was at work but said she would be there when she could. I was terrified to tell her because I knew she would be shattered. The police took a statement from me and actually went to Ashley's work to get more information from her, and they ended up breaking the news. Apparently, Ashley called Matt and left a furious message, even though the cops told her not to say anything, and he completely disappeared after that. There was no Matt or anyone matching his resemblance at the place he said he worked. Ashley had never been to his apartment because he said he had been staying with friends while trying to save money for a trip to Europe. His family lived out of state. She had never met a friend of his because he said they had a falling out because he was choosing to spend so much time with Ashley. It was all lies, and in the end, she was dating a stranger. We don't even know if Matt was his real name. The cherry on top of all this whole thing was when we went through Matt's things. He had left everything when we disappeared, and Ashley and I decided to go through everything. There was a duffel bag that was full of gym clothes, but in one of the compartments, there were about 10 pictures of me. All of them were taken from far away, with the exception of one of me sleeping. The sheets were current, so I know it had to have been at the current apartment, before I started locking my bedroom door. A few pictures dated back to before the incident at my parents' house, which made us think that was him as well. 2 pairs of my missing underwear were there, and I shuddered to think what he did with the rest. A Starbucks lid with my red lipstick marks, a necklace I hadn't even noticed missing, a few other random sick souvenirs. The police never tracked him down. I decided to accept an opportunity overseas that I hadn't been considering and got the hell out of there. Unfortunately, Ashley and I quickly drifted apart. She had a really hard time accepting that her first love was a complete psycho. I think I had some underlying anger for believing all of his lies and letting him into our lives. I don't know what his end game was. Would he have tried to hurt me? Or was he simply content with being in my world? I'll never know. Being stalked changes you. Even when I lived across the world, I looked over my shoulder everywhere I went. I still have no social media accounts attached to my real name. I am married with children and know that he moved on to torment some other poor woman. But every time I visit my hometown, I am tense and keep a low profile. Part of me will always worry that Matt will resurface again. This happened to me last summer. It was all over the news, and if I gave my name, you would be able to Google me and read my testimony. But for now, I will reserve that info. Last summer, I started seeing this new girl, and she was really sweet and pretty perfect. We went out and partied at the Jersey Shore the night prior to this happening, and we didn't get home until about 3 a.m. When we got home, we had a marathon of sex and didn't fall asleep until about 6:30, 7 a.m. It was such a great night. I was on an adrenaline high. At 11 a.m., she woke up Saturday morning, panicked. She began to scramble and throw on clothes. I asked her what was up. Still laying in bed, she yelled at me, "My parents are coming home at 1 p.m. My house is a mess, and I have to go buy food and alcohol. I need your help. Get dressed. I slowly got up and rubbed my eyes, still feeling very alive from the night before. We both got dressed. Me much calmer than her, and I agreed to drive her to Walmart so she could buy everything she needed for her day with her family. When we got to Walmart, she asked me to just let her out by the front entrance and suggested I just waited in the car, as I was still half asleep and would have just slowed her down. She rushed into the store, and I went to go find a parking spot. The lot was packed, so I had to park far away from the tire shop across the lot. I texted her to let her know when she was coming out so I could pull up and pick her up where I dropped her off. As I sat in my car, slightly daydreaming about the great night I had and fantasizing about the great days to come with my new friend, I closed my eyes and recall beginning to get into a rhythmic breathing pattern that would put even the most alert person into a state of REM sleep. I felt myself doze off, and it was amazing. The air conditioning from my car gently easing me to Z-land. A few minutes later, my heart raced as I suddenly and violently was jolted from my nap. Some very sketchy-looking men stood outside my passenger side, holding a red gas can. The way he knocked on my window jarred me, and I was pissed off. I'm a pretty big guy at 6'5", and this creep was very tall as well, but very grunt and slender, a lanky-looking drifter who was probably the kind of scumbag that would take any drug you put in front of him. He motioned for me to roll my window down and stuttered to me, "Hey, sir, do you think you can help me out? I just need a few bucks for gas. My car ran out." As I mentioned, I was pissed off. He woke me up in such a fashion, so my immediate response was a dismissive and rude, "No, I don't have any fucking cash." The vagrant ignored me. "Sir, please, I'm desperate and stranded." Again, I just said no, dismissing him again, and began to roll up my window. He stuck his free hand on the top of my window glass. "Sir, even the change in the cup holder could help me. Please, I'm in a horrible situation." Realizing this guy wasn't going to leave me alone, I decided to give in and reach into my pants pocket, where I finished out a few singles. Before I gave them to him, my friend texted me, "I'm outside, where are you?" "Parked by the tire shop dealing with a homeless person begging me for money," I responded. I put my phone down and rolled my window down, and it automatically went all the way down. I reached toward the man with $3 in my hand, and what happened next changed my life. In less than a second, I could see he was gearing up to attack me. His face got serious, and he pursed up his lips, gritting his teeth. As he dropped the gas can and reached in with his left hand, lunging for my arm and grabbing it with all the strength in his 140-pound frail body, I tried to pull away and screamed to get the hell away from me. But he had my arm in a vice grip. With his free hand, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a syringe, which was loaded with God knows what. He turned, freeing my arm up a bit, but it was too late. He had already stuck me with his needle in my arm and pushed down the plunger, releasing whatever it contained into my bloodstream. I again screamed and pulled my arm free. He pulled back and stared into my car, and I screamed at him that I was going to kill him. This made him even more intense, as I remember him screaming, "Bring it on!" But before I could hear what he said next, I felt my eyes go black and myself lose consciousness. I was out cold. As it turns out, I woke up several hours later in a hospital bed, my friend and my parents and my brother standing over me. They rejoiced as I came to, and my mother called for a doctor and a nurse. I asked what had happened, and my mother told me, "Sweetheart, you were attacked.
A deranged maniac stuck you with a paralyzing agent, and you passed out. Jen spotted your car and what was going on. She's the reason you're alive. She saw the man standing around your car and noticed you weren't moving, so she called 911, and luckily there was a police officer down the street that responded in under 2 minutes. Jen screamed out at the man that she sees him, and she called the cops. They were on their way. He jumped into the car and tried pushing you out of the driver's seat, but before he could, the police arrived and took him down with a taser. It turns out that he was homeless, recently released mental patient, and intended to abduct you, and God only knows what he was going to do to you next, but Jen saved your life. What a huge bombshell to drop on someone who just returned to the land of the living. Jen and I are engaged now. We plan to get married.
Before any judgment is placed, I would like to say I wasn't in the best state of mind during this situation. I just went through a particularly difficult breakup, a suicide attempt, moved back in with my parents, then experienced a sexual assault by a trusted friend. I didn't have a good judge of character, and was by far hitting my rock bottom. After several months at my mother's house, and after the sexual assault, I realized I desperately needed to get out of that atmosphere and tried to get back up on my feet. I found a cheap home for rent and began my life all over again. It wasn't the nicest place, and certainly not as warm and comforting as my last place, but it would do temporarily. Shortly after moving in, still not in the right mindset, and with a huge lack of self-care, I began using almost anything I could get my hands on. Many psychedelics and MDMA. Anyone who has experienced MDMA can tell you it gives you this incredible sense of happiness and content, which at the time I had neither. These short-term bouts of false happiness sucked any remaining serotonin from my brain and left me feeling empty inside. On top of that, after my suicide attempt, I was abruptly taken off of all of my medications, as I used them to hurt myself prior. This meant my sleeping medication and with it trickled down that familiar insomnia. Then my SSRI, which when stopping abruptly can exceedingly send you into a state of manic depression and confusion. It took me out of my agoraphobia and helped me with my PTSD triggers, which having my attacker live just several blocks away on the very same street as another individual whom abused me from 11 until 14, I simply lost all abilities to cope. After some time of intense withdrawals from my anxiety medication and even experiencing a seizure, I began to buy pills. The only ones available to me were Xanax, which I quickly developed a tolerance for, and at my worst was taking anywhere between 12 and 20 milligrams a day. Because of the Xanax abuse, there are many things I didn't completely recall, such as my wedding to a bass-playing musician I had only known for a month, as well as much of the month we spent together. My most vivid memories were lying on the couch watching The Office on Netflix, religiously shaking and sweating in between buys and re-ups from my pill dealer. I began drinking and hanging out with the wrong crowd. The ones that couch surfed much of their lives, destroyed things in their path, didn't work, and commonly used others, burning each individual's bridge as they passed. As I was in no state to actually care, I enjoyed their company, and one individual in particular, I'll refer to as Sideshow Bob, started to become what I thought was my best friend, even wearing a dress at my wedding as my maid of honor. He often wore women's clothes, not because he was a transgender, but because he simply liked to. Some made fun of him for this, but I thought it was cool that he didn't care what others thought. He seemed to have a kind and goofy nature about him that I admired, but as a man that wore women's clothes, he'd often get into my closet. I'd like to add that Bob had very poor hygiene. He wore no deodorant, he showered rarely, and those feet left a smell that permanently absorbed into the carpet fibers that stayed even when I moved out. He would often hop on the couch around 4 p.m. or so and rush to his pizza delivery job. He never stopped to shower or even brush his teeth. He'd even wake up and throw back on the same uniform he had been wearing for weeks, which stunk of cheap weed, pizza grease, and feet. On New Year's Eve 2016, I left my husband at the time. After a serious withdrawal and being around a completely sober, it became obvious he was using meth. I was suspicious of it before, as I used to use it when I was much younger, along with nearly half of all of my family members. I can always sense it. He knew before marrying me that this was going to be a big no for me. My brother in prison, my father's heart attack and death, all combined to meth use. He knew this when he married me, yet kept it a secret. I do blame myself partly for this. It's the kind of things that occurs when you marry a stranger. About a year later, he passed away from a shot laced with fentanyl. They found his body 5 days later. After the separation of my husband, I allowed Bob to stay. He didn't have a room. He slept on the couch. He didn't contribute to the groceries or bills, and quite frankly, turned my home into a disgusting mess. But since my OCD seemed to have dissolved into my drinking, and I preferred not being alone with my thoughts, I didn't really mind. Within a week of leaving my husband, Bob grew increasingly more obsessed with the thought of us being together. I made it very clear I had no intentions with him and valued our friendship, not to mention I was about to experience my first divorce and all the shame that came along with it. I started avoiding him. Every time I'd return to the home, he'd be there, in tears. Some days I'd find him not only in my clothes, but in my bed. Eventually, he quit his job. To have a better chance of seeing me. He'd follow me room to room, demanding to know why it is that he can't see us together. Eventually, I told him if he didn't stop, he'd need to leave. But he was quick to throw back in my face that legally he was a tenant in my home, and he needed 30 days' notice. "I'm not going anywhere, you bitch," is what he said. Things got more aggressive. I grew more uncomfortable and afraid by the days. His tears turned to anger. His questions turned to screaming. One very vivid memory I have of him staring me directly in the eyes, red-faced, spit flying, screaming, "I'm sick of fucking being rejected by women." He was no longer my goofy drinking buddy. He was someone I absolutely could not be around. A police officer suggested I get a restraining order to get him off the premise, which I did. Then I kept the doors locked. His only few possessions in my house were a guitar and an amp, which I placed on the back porch, then notified him. He immediately tried to break into the house, kicking the old front door with some force. I could see it begin to crack at the deadbolt, leaving dark shoe prints on the cracked paint. The police had trouble serving him. He quit his job. He had no actual address, although I provided them with his car description, license plate, and friends' addresses. Morning, noon, and night, I'd find myself crying, pressed up against that door, hoping it wouldn't break open. Every time I called the police, he had already left. I found myself up that night, staring out the window, watching that loud green car of his drive by, feeling my pulse rise, phone in hand. For weeks I received surprise visits from him. Most were terrifying. Occasionally some were thought out. One evening, he had a mutual friend knock on the door, which I happily opened, only for him to quickly jump out from behind the door and attempt entering. I moved as swiftly and as strongly as I could, slammed the door, and locked it. Kicking again, calling 911 again, he'd leave again. After a few months, he moved on. He found a girlfriend who kicked him out quite quickly. He responded by beating her unconscious and attempting to cut her throat. Luckily, a neighbor heard the commotion, and Bob quickly ran. He got off easy on those charges, but of course if you Google his name, you see the repeated charges of serious assault. I spoke with his exes. I saw the photos of what he had done to their faces, their bodies. All I can think about is how that could have been me. The last time I saw him was back in my hometown at the local grocery store as I waited for a cup of coffee. After a tiring 10-hour shift at my last job, he nodded with a kind of smile. I froze, heart throbbing, hand shaking. It was that day I moved, an hour and a half away. It is this month I'll be moving back. I let a friend stay with me and crash on the couch until he became obsessed with the thought of us being together. He began sleeping in my bed when I wasn't home, wore my clothes. If I came home, he'd cry and follow me. Then that eventually turned into him screaming and cornering me. I got a restraining order against him, but the police could never find him to serve him. Despite showing it to him, he still repeatedly tried to break into my home for over a month. Sometime later, he got a girlfriend and beat her unconscious and attempted to cut her throat. I moved an hour and a half away from that town, but will still be returning at the end of this month. Our university is in a kind of a shitty city, but it's small. The main problem is the layout. One street you're in a perfectly safe, middle-class family territory, but one wrong turn and you're in gang turf. There's not a lot of room to get lost safely. My roommate and I don't live in the worst area, but I will say there's a reason our rent is cheap, and why our landlords installed super bright motion detectors lights all around the house. We have been super strict about keeping everything locked up, keeping valuables out of sight of windows, trying to keep the fact that we are a couple of early 20s females living alone on the down low, and besides one small incident in the first month, we were there, nothing had happened, and we generally felt pretty secure last semester. Class doesn't start until the 30th, but I headed back this past Saturday. Roommate has also been back for a couple of weeks because of her internship. This happened the night I got back, around 11 p.m. I was just hanging out in the living room, watching movies. I had bought some wine and just turned 21 before New Year's, so this was very exciting for me, and I was feeling like a real adult. My roommate was sleeping over at her boyfriend's house. I started hearing this tapping noise on the window by our front door. For a little while, I just ignored it, pretty sure it was just my imagination. The blinds were down, I couldn't see anything, but I was still sure that the motion lights would come on if someone was out there, and they weren't, so I was sure it was fine. As time passes, however, I realize that no, that's definitely not tapping, and it's moving from one window to the next, progressively getting closer to where I'm sitting. I muted the TV to listen better, and as soon as I did, the tapping paused, and then came back louder and much faster. At this point, I'm frozen, totally freaked out. But when the tapping moved to the window right next to my head, I grabbed my phone and slid off the couch, crawled into the kitchen, where we have glass sliding doors, and peered out. It was hard to make out, but thankfully the kitchen lights were off, which made it a little easier to see outside. And the lights coming through the living room windows, combined with some light from the street lamps, just barely allowed me to see a man crouched in the garden, face pressed against the glass, and I mean smushed right up against it. He had one hand stretched way up and was tapping with a couple of fingers. I was just like, fuck. I think he was trying different windows because he couldn't see inside well and didn't know where I was sitting, except that the living room was the only room in the house with lights on. Or at least that's what I was hoping when I crawled out of the living room, down the hall, and into my bedroom. I locked the door, but kept the lights off, and called the police. They asked if he was actively trying to break into the house, and I said no, and they said they would send someone over as quickly as possible. I was really hoping the officer would stay on the line, but they just gave me instructions to call again if things escalated and hold tight. 15 minutes later, still no police. I wasn't sure if he was out there, but I was trying to find out on my own. I'd been trying to call my roommate, but she wasn't answering her phone, and I didn't know who else to call. Eventually, I decided to call my ex-boyfriend, because he had been my go-to person for the last 2 years, and I couldn't think of anyone else. He's a good dude, and still came over, since he lives only a few minutes away. Around 10 minutes after I called him, I could tell he was there, because I could hear shouting and then running. Another 5 minutes or so, and he calls, and he says he's out front and to let him in. He told me there was a dude with a small bag at the kitchen door, peering in and trying to force the door open. He yelled and the guy dropped the bag and started running. My ex chased him a little bit until they got to this one shitty road towards the back of my neighborhood, and then he headed back. Motion lights didn't come on this whole time. A few minutes later, the cops came. It was only over a half an hour since I called them, but it felt like so much longer. Cops searched the area, didn't find anyone. The only thing that they found was a bag. The only thing that was in the bag was lube and a box of condoms, which makes me want to die if I think about it too hard. I didn't have a solid description of him, having not seen him well, and neither did my ex. The cops said that they would keep someone outside, and my ex spent the night in the living room to keep an eye on me. My roommate finally came back at like 7 a.m. going, "What the hell happened?" Her boyfriend also spent the night every night since. Honestly, I don't know if I was just shocked or processing, but the next couple of days, I was kinda, about the whole thing. Even though I knew the guy was still out there, my roommate called our landlords and bitched at them about the lights not working. I went to my job and told my coworker about it. But then yesterday my roommate called me as soon as she got out of her internship, freaking out, and told me she had something to tell me. So her internship with the social work program has her working with and occasionally leading a group of court-ordered drug addicts, which includes some sex offenders. She told me that while she was leading the group, she was just not getting along with one of the members, who was being very contrary and just acting annoyed with what she was saying. And towards the end, he said something along the lines of, "Your roommate's cute. You can tell her I like Asian girls, and that we need to fix our front porch light." I'm pretty sure that he didn't have an opportunity to see my face that night, so I don't know how many times he has been there. She reported him. Her supervisor just got in contact with the police and he confessed easily. I guess he probably followed my roommate home one night, which is terrifying to me, and I'm glad he never tried to do anything to her. And he also must have known that she would report him after he said those things to her. So I don't understand his thinking at all. It's just today that I'm starting to feel really freaked out about the whole thing, and I will probably not be spending the night alone here for a while.
The story that I am about to tell happened because I guess that I am too nice to people. When I was 17, I was a pretty blonde girl who was very nerdy. I would often get guys who wanted to be more than just friends when they found out I liked games and films, but they always just made their crushes known, and I would gently let them down. I had a high school boyfriend at the time. I worked at a movie theater in the Midwest. I loved this job and became good friends with the people I worked with. It was the perfect job for a teen who loved movies and needed to work after school. That was until I met Simon. Simon was a guy who worked at the theater with me. He seemed nice enough, a little geeky and not very attractive, but kinda just a regular guy, and I was friendly, as I always was. He was almost 10 years older than me, so I wasn't too worried about him thinking I wanted to be more than just friends. As time went on, he gave me more and more attention, talking to me for hours during the downtime when movies were playing. I suspected that he might like me, but I wasn't too worried as he was a manager and I wasn't, and dating between managers and staff was not allowed, so I thought he would just keep it to himself. Then after a year, I was asked to move to another theater as the one I worked at would be shutting down in a few months. I agreed, but I was the only member of the staff to be offered this option. I realize now that this was not as fortuitous as I thought it would be. Just a week after I started at the new theater, Simon showed up to say hi. I was friendly as always and was nice to him. After all, we were the same movie chain, so he would come here to watch movies for free if he wanted to. I thought it was innocent, but soon started to feel uncomfortable with all of the time Simon was spending hanging around at my theater. I asked my coworkers if he came in when I wasn't there, and they said no. Then it dawned on me that we no longer worked at the same theater, so he was free to pursue me romantically without worrying about his job. This made me worry as he started outwardly, if not awkwardly, flirting with me. I found out later that a girl at my job who didn't like me had given Simon a copy of my schedule for the next 2 months, so I started to hide. Every time I saw him, I would make some excuse to go and hide in the stockroom or the projection booth. It was starting to make me very uneasy. My boss, who's still a great friend to me, noticed how uncomfortable I was and told me if I wanted, I could report it to the home office to get him to stop. I thought this was taking it too far, and I declined, thinking eventually that he might give up. Well, he did not. He came in close to my birthday and dropped off a card and a CD with lots of rather creepy music on it. I had finally had enough and told my boss to report him. Management told me he wasn't allowed to come to my theater again, or he would be fired. I didn't see him for a few months. I thought it was over, but then I had people I worked with at the old theater who went to high school with me coming up to me in the halls and cussing me out for getting Simon in trouble. They said that I had led him on and that he was a lonely guy who had a crush, and it was cruel that I got him in trouble or that I wouldn't give him a chance. I was horrified that he had been spreading these rumors to people I thought were my friends and were now attacking me at school. I spent the next few months afraid to go anywhere. I lived in a small town and was terrified of going out in case I ran into him. I am generally a nervous person who scares easily, so my parents thought I was overreacting. My boss told me not to worry, and that Simon probably had given up on me. Oh, how I wish that had been true. The day the old theater closed down, I was at work. I had to work late, and me and my boss were the last ones to leave for the night. My boss, Peter, asked me to wait for him so we could lock up together. It was about 2 a.m. once we left. The doors had been locked since 10 p.m. No customers could get in. As we walked out, my boss, who had a kind of sick sense of humor, was joking about Simon and his crush on me, probably trying to make light of it to cheer me up. When we stepped outside, I turned to lock the door, and my boss shouts, "There he is!" I thought he was joking again, and turned to tell him it wasn't funny, but he wasn't joking. Simon was standing there, with just Peter between us. I froze. My entire body went rigid. I didn't know what to do. I heard Simon say my name, and saw he tried to get around my boss, but Peter spread his arms out and blocked him for me. I saw that his eyes were fixed on me. Peter told Simon to get out of here and that I didn't want to see him. I struggled to unlock the door, which was notoriously sticky to get open. I could hear Simon trying to get my attention, but I just focused on the lock. Finally, it gave way, and I rushed inside, running for the office, which had a deadbolt security door. I unlocked it and sat inside, hyperventilating. Peter came in and shut the door, checking I was okay. He told Simon to go home and not to come back, or he would call the cops. We sat in the office and waited for what seemed like forever. Peter then said that he would go and check out to make sure that he had left, and I stayed in the locked office. A few minutes go by, and I hear Peter's voice telling me that he was coming back in. When he opened the door, he looked furious and headed straight for the phone. I asked what was going on, and he said that Simon was still out there. Apparently, He had parked in the shadow of the theater where it is hard to see. He parked in such a way that I would have had to walk past him to get into my car. He had parked his van, a van I didn't know he had in the shadows. Peter had found him crouched down beside the van, as if waiting for something, waiting for me to walk by. Peter had shouted he was calling the cops and ran back inside. By the time the cops showed up, he had left. They took a statement and Peter told them all Simon's contact information, as he was still in the system. We guessed he showed up today because he is no longer at risk of losing his job, as the theater had closed down. I never saw Simon again, but that doesn't mean that I wasn't terrified that I might run into him again. I spent the whole year until I moved away terrified I might run into him again. I never did, but it did ruin what should have been a great summer before I left for college. I hate to think what would have happened if my boss hadn't been there that night, or hadn't been smart enough to check that Simon had left. I am still good friends with Peter. He even came to my wedding. I owe him an unknown debt. And to Simon, wherever you are, let's not meet again.
I am a 27-year-old female, and this happened to me when I was 24. I live in Los Angeles and have for my entire life. I was feeling lonely, so I decided to go on Craigslist to try to find someone to hang out with. Not necessarily to date, but someone to just chill with. If it led somewhere, then so be it. That was my thinking. I emailed a few guys, one of which stood out to me. He sent me some pictures, and I was fine with how he looked, and he seemed nice enough. We agreed to meet and go have coffee. It took him a lot longer than he said it would to get there, and once he did arrive, I instantly regretted what I was doing. But, being overly nice, I got in his car, and instead of heading to Starbucks as we planned, he drove to a CVS. I was like, what are you doing? To which he said he had to return some stuff to CVS so that he'd have money. I was super uncomfortable already and just wanted to get out of there, but again, my shyness got the better of me, and I just waited it out. Once he returned whatever it was he was returning, he then said he had to stop by his apartment. We pulled into this underground garage, and he said he'd be right back. You don't know how badly I wish I had run right then, while he was gone, but I didn't. He got back in his car, and I could tell right away that he was high on something. Having been to rehab before myself, it was blatantly obvious. I told him that I'd gotten an emergency phone call while he was upstairs and that I was sorry, but I had to be taken back. I told him he could just drop me off at the nearest train station. I lived in a city like an hour away, so I wasn't about to have him drive me all the way home. We got on the freeway. That was the fastest route to the main stop. But we ended up passing the exit. I told him a few miles ahead of time which one it was, but he did not say anything. He just ignored me. I thought maybe he just hadn't heard me. Hey, that was the exit, actually. You passed it, I said, instead of pulling over to the right lanes. He kept pulling further and further over to the left until we were all the way in the far left-hand lane. I asked him what he was doing, trying to keep my cool. I can't honestly remember his exact words, but it went something along the lines of, I'm not dropping you off. We're having sex. Why do you think I did this? I looked at him with my jaw to the ground and asked him, So, you are refusing to drop me off? I asked him. Yes, he said, and then he sped up his car. The first thing I thought was obviously calling the police, so I pulled my cell out. He turned towards me and hit me in the face hard, and I dropped my phone because I was so shocked. The phone had fallen somewhere below his seat somewhere, I couldn't get to it. I was panicking. As we continued to drive, I tried desperately to think of what I should do. We came up on another interstate. For some reason, seeing the freeways intersect and seeing that we were about to get on yet another freeway was hugely ominous to me, and I decided I could not let him get on the next freeway. I couldn't get out of the car, so I did the only thing I could think of. I took a breath, grabbed the steering wheel, turning it as hard as I could to the right. He was so shocked he didn't even try to grab it back from me. As we crashed into one, then another car, and crashed into the side barrier, he turned towards me and started hitting me while screaming, "You fucking bitch! You fucked up everything!" I put my legs up to block the blows from his fist. I ended up falling backwards out of the car after managing to put my hand up and open the door. I ran to one of the cars we had crashed into that had pulled over behind us. The guy in the car had his phone out, presumably calling the cops. I knocked on his window screaming that this psycho tried to kidnap me, and he rolled it up all the way. I couldn't believe it. When I looked back, Psycho was coming towards me. So I said, "Fuck it, clearly no one is going to help," and ran towards the fence, and was even weaker because of what had happened. So literally had to lean on the fence until it bent enough for me to fall over. Climbing up a chain-link fence was not an option at that moment. Luckily, instead of him following me, he ran the other direction. He just left his car on the side of the freeway. Once I was over the fence, I realized that I was on the same horse trails that I was familiar with because I had worked at the equestrian center nearby. So I just walked through the miles of trails until I got into the nearest city, which was Burbank, and called the police from a bowling alley. I never found out what happened to that psycho. The cops never told me after I made the report, but I hope he got arrested for, trying to kidnap and rape me. So, crazy, sadistic psycho rapist, let's never, ever meet again. I lived in a small coastal town in Italy, and as every summer approached, my mom, my little sister, and I would go to the beach almost every day. My dad was always working day shifts. It was a 10-minute drive, and we recently decided to go to the next town because the water wasn't as deep. We parked our car in a made-up parking lot, basically a field covered in sand and with some old trees arranged in parallel lines. And after crossing a small bridge, we would walk to the beach. The day went as any other summer day, swimming, napping under the sun, and whatnot. We then decided to take off and get back home. While we approached the small bridge, I noticed a green car sprinting down the road with flashing lights, honking as it's getting closer and closer. I can hear the driver laughing almost hysterically, pulling his head out the window and screaming, "I won, I won, I won! I'm the first!" Weird, but whatever. My mom tells us to get close to her, almost knowing what was going to happen, because after a couple of seconds, this guy slammed his brakes and turned to go onto the bridge, accelerating, actually passing not 3 feet away from my little sister. I, being the tough 12-year-old kid that I was, just yelled at him without giving it too much thought. "Fuck you, asshole!" My mom just stared at me and whispered, "Just shut up, and let's go!" I can hear the guy slamming the door of his car and started yelling to my mother, "You whore, what do you want, huh? Come to me, get closer," while grinning and spitting on the ground. I then tried to see if anyone else was close to us in the parking lot, but as luck would have it, nobody was around. So there we were, me and my 7-year-old sister, paralyzed, with this 6-foot guy approaching us. I had really no idea what to do, and I was so scared for my mom. Then suddenly she opened the trunk of our car and took the metal rod used for the beach umbrella, and I swear I've never seen that look in her eyes again. She told him with a gruff voice, Try to come near, and I will fucking kill you. I swear on my kids, I will kill you." At that point, the guy started walking away, but not without taking his eyes off of us, and talking to himself about what a massive bitch my mom was. In the meantime, my mom started screaming for help, hoping that someone getting to the beach would come, but nobody showed up. Weeks passed by, and we stopped going to that town for fear of meeting this weirdo. So we go back to our usual sea town to enjoy the last days of summer. One afternoon, I'm in the water playing with my sister, and we see the water getting crisp as when you throw a rock in it. Well, we look up, and it's the same fucking guy, sitting by himself on the beach, throwing small rocks in the sea at what we thought was just our direction, and just staring at us. We quickly get out of the water and tell my mom, who recognized him. The guy is still throwing rocks in the water with many other kids. Suddenly, he turns his head. He didn't speak a word. He just stood and stared. My mom told us sometimes there are just some crazy dudes that are completely out of this world. While still creeped out, we went home. After those encounters, I literally felt my heart sink just about every time I saw the same car model around. One of my teachers in high school had the exact same green car, so I had a fear of a particular model and color of car. Fast forward some years, and my sister and I started going to the swimming pool. All things considered, I loved it. Swimming is my favorite sport, and every one of my coaches would take me and my sister as their favorites because we trained hard and wanted to be as good a swimmer as we could be. One day, we finished one set of exercise, and my sister comes up to me almost shivering and says, "The weird guy, he's here. What do I do?" I try to peek, and it's definitely that guy not 10 feet away from us. Damn. During the next sets of exercises, I would peek underwater to see if he was staring at us, but apparently he was minding his own business. Still, he would speak loud to himself every time he finished the set. We finished our lesson and go to the respective changing rooms, and as my sister gets out of the water, I notice this guy standing near the edge of the pool, staring at her. He had a look like he was trying to figure out where he had seen her before. But my sister bolted into the showers, and this guy just shrugged it off. I wasn't afraid, though, this time, as I had my 6'2", 240-pound instructor next to me, and I knew that if this guy tried something, my teacher would at least change his facial traits. That was the last time we saw that weirdo, and honestly, it stayed at the back of my mind. It just popped up since I started lurking, so what I have left of it now is just strange feelings every time I notice a green sedan passing by.
I'm in my late 20s and female. We were there for about 2 weeks while my mom underwent treatment for cancer. Unfortunately, soon after arriving, she experienced a lot of pain in her leg, and we later found out that the cancer had spread there and her leg could break off at any wrong step. This meant that if I was going to see anything, I had to go alone. This was fine, as the town we were in was extremely small and filled mostly with the old and sick. There was a larger town only about a mile away, up and over a fairly steep hill, and a large park in between. It was about noon, and my mom wasn't going to need me to be around, so I decided to go for a walk around the park. To get there, I just had to walk down the path across a street lined with inns and cafes on a side leading to the park. There's a lot of twisting paths crisscrossing each other, a lot of benches, a couple of fountains, and 1 or 2 community buildings. I chose a path that would take me right beside an underground fountain about as deep as my shoulders, with steps leading down to the spout. It was there I first saw him. I was headed almost directly toward the fountain when a man's head pops up. Looking directly at me, I looked back at him for a second, thinking I had surprised him just as much
I was the only one who looked away. When I looked back, I realized he was still watching me, and then I noticed he had one arm crossed over his chest and moving, as though he was touching himself. As soon as I realized this, I looked away and changed my direction to give him a wide berth. I was soon stunned in disbelief that I convinced myself that whatever he was doing had nothing to do with me, and that as long as I kept walking, he'd go back to being weird all by himself. I'd turned down a path that for the immediate area was wide open. I was still close to the cafes and inns, and the occasional other person also taking a midway walk. I was almost to an area that would take the path through patches of woods, which would also take me out of the public eye when I looked back to see if this guy was still in the fountain, but he was gone. Surprised, I quickly did a circle and noticed he had taken off, doing a wide loop that left a lot of opportunity for us to cross paths again. If I didn't change directions once again, I couldn't believe it. I thought it's the middle of the day. We're in a quiet town, about a mile away from a larger one. There's no one here but old and sick people. There's no way a predator would be out here, now hunting me. But still I stopped and decided to change directions again. This time my dumbass decided to take a tiny path that would lead me to the base of the hill that would go over to the larger town and was heavily wooded. I get up there to where the tree started and decide to look again, and that's when I noticed that he had also changed his direction and was practically jogging away from me. I got to where I was a safe distance away and pulled out my phone and started recording myself. I figured I would just look like I was a video chatting with someone. This is when I was shown without a doubt that this guy was after me, because not long after I made it across the park, he comes down the very same path, looking side to side, looking for me, eventually spots me. I had very bright dyed red hair, and I was pretty easy to spot in such a wide open area. It's at this distance of the town, should this guy book it back towards me, that I kept wandering around testing to see how far this guy will go. He keeps following me, trying to stay out of sight, because at one point I turn around suddenly and watch him sprint back into some trees until eventually I go up a hill that has zero cover for him to use, and I lose track of him. I continue on to explore a different small town, making sure I'm always in public space and easily seen, but I never saw him again. Trust your gut. My head was telling me that there was no way that this could be happening to me, and I almost tested it by walking into the woods. But my gut screamed, bad idea, and I could not be more relieved I listened. Trust your gut.
To give a little background information, this started in the winter of 2012. I was 23 years old at the time and living with my dad. My mom and my brother were living in another house about 10 minutes away from us. One morning I woke up around 8 a.m. because I had an early doctor's appointment, and I went outside to see a note pinned to the windshield wiper of our car. The note said, "I'm going to kill you, scum." I kinda laughed it off. I assumed the note was from my dad, who had a habit of complaining to parents in our neighborhood about their children's shitty behavior. There were these twin boys who liked to try and catch and torture squirrels. He often marched them home by their ears to complain about them to their parents. I thought one of the parents was just being a douchebag, so my dad and I didn't bother with it too much. Later in the day, while talking to my mom on the phone, I mentioned the note to her half-heartedly in a casual way, and I was shocked by her response. She responded by emphatically warning me several times to make sure all of my windows and doors were locked, and to bring a weapon to bed with me at night. I was a bit taken aback because she'd never said anything to me like that before. She'd never even given me the good touch, bad touch talk. She reminded me at least 12 times over the course of the conversation to bring a knife or a baseball bat to bed with me, and to lock my bedroom door at night. I thought she was just overreacting, so I waved her off. Then, other weird things started happening. We started getting random packages and deliveries sent to our house. Bibles and Qurans, newspapers, porn flyers, pizzas, and moving trucks that we hadn't ordered. The first few times it happened, I thought it was a mistake, but as it kept happening, I came to the conclusion that somebody must be pulling a prank on us. We didn't know who it was, so there was nothing we could really do about it, but apologizing profusely to yet another confused pizza delivery man. In September of that year, I started taking a night school class with my best friend. The course went from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. every Monday and Wednesday night, and after the class, his mom would pick us up and drive us home. Sometime in November, his mom dropped me off from school, and I went inside and chilled on the couch for a couple of hours. I like to wind down before I go to bed a bit, or I can't sleep. I ended up falling asleep on the couch. Something woke me up abruptly at about 4 a.m. in the morning. I heard the unmistakable sound of a car tire being slashed, and it sounded like our car. What the hell is going on? We didn't have any enemies. In retrospect, this was probably a stupid thing to do, especially considering I'm a relatively small female. I'm only 5'5", and I was 23 at the time, but I grabbed a generic kitchen knife and went outside to check it out. When I got outside, I discovered immediately that I was correct. There was a man in our driveway slashing our car tires. Unwisely, I admittedly yelled, "Hey, you!" and he turned around to face me. That was when I noticed what he was slashing our tires with, an enormous hunting knife, at least 6 inches long. He looked surprised, but then defiant, and began to advance towards me with the knife slightly raised. I just froze. I didn't know what to do. He was coming at me so fast I couldn't even think. Thankfully, at that exact moment, my across-the-street neighbor, who had also heard him slashing our tires, turned on his porch light and yelled out the window, "Hey, I'm calling the cops." The man yelled back, "I don't give a fuck. Call them then." But he quickly retreated back to his car, where I could see a middle-aged woman with long brown hair waiting for him on the passenger seat. Our eyes locked, and I knew instantly that we had met before, but I couldn't quite put my finger on where or when. I just knew in my gut that I had met this woman before. They sped off into the night, and we called the cops, who said they couldn't do anything for us because they didn't know who had done it. I mean, isn't that the kind of your job, though, to find out who did it? Herp-a-derp. I called my mom to tell her what happened and to ask her if she had any idea who would have done this to us. She immediately said no, but there was something in her voice. I could just tell that she wasn't being honest. A few weeks later, I decided to go to my mom's house to spend a day or two there, determined to get some answers. As soon as I walked in the front door, I knew something was wrong. The second she saw me, she just started bawling her eyes out. She took me by the hand and sat me on the couch and explained the whole story to me, start to finish. It's necessary for me to give a little background information here. My mom is a businesswoman by trade. She was still in sales at the time, but she's also a bit of a hippy-dippy. Astrology and pot and reincarnation and Mercury is retrograding, so don't get into any arguments this week type of person. A couple of months ago, before this all started, she had ended up being referred a new client named Adrian by her weed dealer. Yes, my mom smokes weed. This is Canada. Everyone smokes here. Adrian was her dealer's girlfriend, and she was interested in buying Arbonne, so my mom invited her over to her apartment to look at some makeup samples. They started chatting a bit about a variety of topics, and my mom let it slip that her last name was Hayes. As my mom told me, Adrian had paused for a few seconds, looked at her, and then said, "Hayes? Did you used to be married to a man named Darian Hayes?" My mom answered that yes, Darian Hayes, my father, was her ex-husband.
Then, shockingly, this Adrian woman had actually burst into tears, threw her arms around my mom in a hug, and began to tell her this horrific story about all the disgusting things that my dad had done to her. Apparently, she was 14 years old. She was now in her mid-30s. I would have been about 4 years old at the time. This would have happened around 1994. She had been dating a man named Andrew, who happened to be living with my dad at the time after my parents' divorce. According to Adrian, these men, her boyfriend Andrew, Andrew's twin brother Daniel, and my father, had taken turns beating her, sexually assaulting her, and then forcing her into prostitution in order to make money off of her. Eventually, they ended up selling her into child prostitution, from which she said she never recovered. At this point, I realized that this is where I'd recognized her from. My dad had been roommates with her boyfriend Andrew, and I used to see all three of them when I went over there to visit him every second weekend. I sobbed inconsolably during the whole retelling of this story, telling my mother how after this traumatic experience she had turned to drugs and alcohol to numb the pain of her abuse, and that she had been addicted to crack and alcohol off and on ever since because of what my father had done to her. My mom was shocked. She didn't know what to do. On the one hand, she knew my father to be a generous, soft-spoken, and kind person who had never lifted a finger to her or any other person, and who rarely raised his voice. But on the other hand, it seemed odd that Adrian would just happen to remember his name all these years later. If she had been lying, we didn't know who to believe. After several hours of crying and much consoling on my mother's part, Adrian finally left, and that was when the stalking began. A few days after this encounter, my mother came home from work to find Adrian's boyfriend sitting on her couch, waiting for her. He immediately told her that he was planning on killing my father, and that my father deserved to die because he was a pedophile piece of shit, and that if my mom told anybody at all, especially the cops, that he would be sure to kill me as well. He then concluded his threat by describing the layout of our living room and exactly what outfit I was wearing that day. From then on, he and/or Adrian would text or call her several times a day to threaten and taunt her, telling her that they were going to call the cops on my dad and have him thrown in prison, that they were going to have him killed, and that if she told anybody, they would hire somebody to rape and murder me. Naturally, my mother was absolutely terrified. She was from an upper-middle-class family who had immigrated to Canada from Germany. She had never dealt with this type of person before. She stopped eating, she couldn't sleep, and she even stopped going to work. She lost 30 pounds, and her hair started to fall out from stress. She started having panic attacks because she didn't know what to do. Later, she told me that she understood how I felt because I have an anxiety disorder that causes me to experience panic attacks. Eventually, after the night when I almost got stabbed, she decided that she had to call the cops. She couldn't take the chance that they would hurt me. She had to do something about it, and what she found out was shocking. Adrian was also known to the police, and my mom told them the story. He was so well known that they weren't even surprised to hear her story. In fact, they told her Adrian had done this exact same thing at least to a dozen other men. She would meet and blackmail men into giving her money, electronics, drugs, etc., threatening to call the cops and report them for rape if they did not. Her boyfriend, who was a dealer of other drugs other than just weed, as it turned out, would often use his drug connections to intimidate and extort the men, and for some reason he never questioned her stories of being raped, abused, and enslaved by all of the other different types of men. Adrian was a crack and heroin addict and a prostitute who would get arrested on possession and drug distribution charges. She would attempt to make deals with the police by offering them information about men who were pedophiles in exchange for less time in prison. She eventually did this so many times that the police stopped believing in her. After my mom called the cops, the whole story came undone, and Adrian and her boyfriend, thankfully, haven't bothered us since. But it's been over a year since the whole thing happened, and I'm still terrified to leave the curtains open at nighttime in case somebody is watching me. I don't think I'll ever be able to feel fully safe in this house ever again. So Adrian, let's not meet again, ever. This happened on December 21st, 2016. I am a 21-year-old Canadian girl, 19 at the time. At this time in my life, I was pretty desperate for attention, and so I went on a lot of bad dates and put myself in a lot of bad situations. When this pretty cute guy started hitting on me, I was pretty flattered and agreed to do some mushrooms at his place and to get to know each other better. I'm not going to go into details, but let's just say that it was a really bad idea, so I ended up leaving his place around midnight, high as fuck, with a long and cold walk to the train station. It really didn't bother me, though. To be honest, I was just happy to be out of that situation. And on my way home, I also really enjoyed the cold, and had done mushrooms many times by this point, and was really enjoying the walk. It was just a straight walk in mostly residential streets until you came into a busier street that leads to downtown. It separates the residential streets from the mall that I worked at the time, and a Wendy's that was closer to the lights, where I had to cross. Just beyond the mall is the train station. You have to walk either through the mall parking lot or through a field where the old high school used to be to get to the train station. So I got to the lights and was waiting to cross. However, it was quite late and the lights were taking what felt like forever to change. That's when a big blue pickup truck came driving down the road away from downtown. It slowed right down as it passed by me before speeding off. I probably should have sensed some danger, but my high ass was worried that he slowed down to let me pass, and when I didn't, he left, making me think that the light wasn't going to change. I then noticed that the same blue truck had pulled around the block and was sitting in the parking lot at the closed Wendy's. Now I realized that something was wrong. The light finally changed and I walked across the street. I planned on just walking past it and going through the mall parking lot to get to the train. I kept my head down as I walked. The man in the truck yelled something at me as I walked past. I looked up, and in my state I thought it was a regular customer of mine as I worked at the mall. I raised my arms in the air like, "Fuck, you got me." But as I approached the truck, I realized how wrong I was. This was a completely different person, and I was now at the side of his truck in an abandoned Wendy's parking lot. I just stared at him. I could feel someone staring at me from the back seat of the truck, right behind the driver's seat, but there was no one in the front passenger seat. The driver smiled and asked me things straight out of the PSA, things like, "What part of the city do you live in? And do you live alone?" I was being polite and actually answered his questions truthfully, because for some reason I thought he was a cop. I mean, that has to be why he is questioning me. He obviously knew I was high and was trying to make sure I got home safe, right? Wrong. In a matter of maybe 5 minutes, he knew what part of the city I lived in, that I lived with my dad, and that I planned on taking the train home. It wasn't until that he straight up asked for directions to my house that I played dumb and said I didn't know. He kind of raised his eyebrows at me and said,
"So you don't know where you live?"
I kind of laughed and was like, "Nope, I guess not." And I walked around to the back of his truck, headed for the field to get to the train station, and he pulled away. I had to cross a small street to get to the field. I noticed further down the street with the truck parked facing me and looked at it. It inched forward a little bit to make it seem like he was leaving. I turned around and kept walking. I turned around a few seconds later to see the truck is still there. I put my arms in the air and yelled, "I fucking see you." He then drove off as he was going to circle the mall. I ran into the field and pulled out my phone and dialed 911 and paused before pressing call.
I was clearly high on drugs, and there was a good chance that I wouldn't be taken seriously. I was also worried that I was going to have to take the cops back to the guy's house as it had been, where I got the drugs from. So instead I called my dad. By the time he picked up the phone, I was crying. I explained to him what was happening, and he said to get somewhere safe and call a cab. If I had been smart, I would have taken the train a couple of steps in the wrong direction, and then called a cab. I didn't. Instead, I went to the train station that he knew I was going to be at and called the cab. I waited for 20 minutes. I kept peeking out to see if he was there, but I didn't see him. My cab arrived, and I got in and told the cab where to go. I was looking behind us the whole time. Just before we made it to downtown, I noticed that a large truck was behind us, but I couldn't see the color until we turned, and the truck turned behind us. It was, of course, blue. I started freaking out, and I begged for the cab to pull over. He did so reluctantly, and the blue truck slowly rolled by and then turned the corner, like he was going to drive back around the block. I yelled at the driver to start going again, and he did so, very annoyed. I finally did make it back home and collapsed on the bed in tears. I didn't leave my house for 2 days, terrified that he was driving around my neighborhood looking for me. I did see him and his truck one more time, but it's not really worth mentioning. Please be safe, people. There are so many things that I could have done to prevent this from happening, but I was too high and dumb to think straight. To give a little background information, this started in the winter of 2012. I was 23 years old at the time and living with my dad. My mom and my brother were living in another house about 10 minutes away from us. One morning I woke up around 8 a.m. because I had an early doctor's appointment, and I went outside to see a note pinned to the windshield wiper of our car. The note said, "I'm going to kill you, scum." I kinda laughed it off. I assumed the note was from my dad, who had a habit of complaining to parents in our neighborhood about their children's shitty behavior. There were these twin boys who liked to try and catch and torture squirrels. He often marched them home by their ears to complain about them to their parents. I thought one of the parents was just being a douchebag, so my dad and I didn't bother with it too much. Later in the day, while talking to my mom on the phone, I mentioned the note to her half-heartedly in a casual way, and I was shocked by her response. She responded by emphatically warning me several times to make sure all of my windows and doors were locked, and to bring a weapon to bed with me at night. I was a bit taken aback because she'd never said anything to me like that before. She'd never even given me the good touch, bad touch talk. She reminded me at least 12 times over the course of the conversation to bring a knife or a baseball bat to bed with me and to lock my bedroom door at night. I thought she was just overreacting, so I waved her off. Then other weird things started happening. We started getting random packages and deliveries sent to our house. Bibles and Qurans, newspapers, porn flyers, pizzas, and moving trucks that we hadn't ordered. The first few times it happened, I thought it was a mistake, but as it kept happening, I came to the conclusion that somebody must be pulling a prank on us. We didn't know who it was, so there was nothing we could really do about it, but apologizing profusely to yet another confused pizza delivery man. In September of that year, I started taking a night school class with my best friend. The course went from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. every Monday and Wednesday night, and after the class, his mom would pick us up and drive us home. Sometime in November, his mom dropped me off from school, and I went inside and chilled on the couch for a couple of hours. I like to wind down before I go to bed a bit, or I can't sleep. I ended up falling asleep on the couch. Something woke me up abruptly at about 4 a.m. in the morning. I heard the unmistakable sound of a car tire being slashed, and it sounded like our car. What the hell is going on? We didn't have any enemies. In retrospect, This was probably a stupid thing to do, especially considering I'm a relatively small female. I'm only 5'5", and I was 23 at the time, but I grabbed a generic kitchen knife and went outside to check it out. When I got outside, I discovered immediately that I was correct. There was a man in our driveway slashing our car tires. Unwisely, I admittedly yelled, "Hey, you!" and he turned around to face me. That was when I noticed what he was slashing our tires with, an enormous hunting knife, at least 6 inches long. He looked surprised, but then defiant, and began to advance towards me with the knife slightly raised. I just froze. I didn't know what to do. He was coming at me so fast I couldn't even think. Thankfully, at that exact moment, my across-the-street neighbor, who had also heard him slashing our tires, turned on his porch light and yelled out the window, "Hey, I'm calling the cops." The man yelled back, "I don't give a fuck. Call them then." But he quickly retreated back to his car, where I could see a middle-aged woman with long brown hair waiting for him on the passenger seat. Our eyes locked, and I knew instantly that we had met before, but I couldn't quite put my finger on where or when. I just knew in my gut that I had met this woman before. They sped off into the night, and we called the cops, who said they couldn't do anything for us because they didn't know who had done it. I mean, isn't that the kind of your job, though, to find out who did it? Herp-a-derp. I called my mom to tell her what happened and to ask her if she had any idea who would have done this to us. She immediately said no, but there was something in her voice. I could just tell that she wasn't being honest. A few weeks later, I decided to go to my mom's house to spend a day or two there, determined to get some answers. As soon as I walked in the front door, I knew something was wrong. The second she saw me, she just started bawling her eyes out. She took me by the hand and sat me on the couch and explained the whole story to me, start to finish. It's necessary for me to give a little background information here. My mom is a businesswoman by trade. She was still in sales at the time, but she's also a bit of a hippy-dippy. Astrology and pot and reincarnation and Mercury is retrograding, so don't get into any arguments this week type of person. A couple of months ago, before this all started, she had ended up being referred a new client named Adrian by her weed dealer. Yes, my mom smokes weed. This is Canada. Everyone smokes here. Adrian was her dealer's girlfriend, and she was interested in buying Arbonne, so my mom invited her over to her apartment to look at some makeup samples. They started chatting a bit about a variety of topics, and my mom let it slip that her last name was Hayes. As my mom told me, Adrian had paused for a few seconds, looked at her, and then said, "Hayes? Did you used to be married to a man named Darian Hayes?" My mom answered that yes, Darian Hayes, my father, was her ex-husband. Then, shockingly, this Adrian woman had actually burst into tears, threw her arms around my mom in a hug, and began to tell her this horrific story about all the disgusting things that my dad had done to her. Apparently, she was 14 years old. She was now in her mid-30s. I would have been about 4 years old at the time. This would have happened around 1994. She had been dating a man named Andrew, who happened to be living with my dad at the time after my parents' divorce. According to Adrian, these men, her boyfriend Andrew, Andrew's twin brother Daniel, and my father, had taken turns beating her, sexually assaulting her, and then forcing her into prostitution in order to make money off of her. Eventually, they ended up selling her into child prostitution, from which she said she never recovered. At this point, I realized that this is where I'd recognized her from. My dad had been roommates with her boyfriend Andrew, and I used to see all three of them when I went over there to visit him every second weekend. I sobbed inconsolably during the whole retelling of this story. telling my mother how after this traumatic experience she had turned to drugs and alcohol to numb the pain of her abuse, and that she had been addicted to crack and alcohol off and on ever since because of what my father had done to her. My mom was shocked. She didn't know what to do. On the one hand, she knew my father to be a generous, soft-spoken, and kind person who had never lifted a finger to her or any other person, and who rarely raised his voice. But on the other hand, it seemed odd that Adrian would just happen to remember his name all these years later. If she had been lying, he didn't know who to believe. After several hours of crying and much consoling on my mother's part, Adrian finally left, and that was when the stalking began. A few days after this encounter, my mother came home from work to find Adrian's boyfriend sitting on her couch, waiting for her. He immediately told her that he was planning on killing my father, and that my father deserved to die because he was a pedophile piece of shit, and that if my mom told anybody at all, especially the cops, that he would be sure to kill me as well. He then concluded his threat by describing the layout of our living room and exactly what outfit I was wearing that day. From then on, he and/or Adrian would text or call her several times a day to threaten and taunt her, telling her that they were going to call the cops on my dad and have him thrown in prison, that they were going to have him killed, and that if she told anybody, they would hire somebody to rape and murder me. Naturally, my mother was absolutely terrified. She was from an upper-middle-class family who had immigrated to Canada from Germany. She had never dealt with this type of person before. She stopped eating, she couldn't sleep, and she even stopped going to work. She lost 30 pounds, and her hair started to fall out from stress. She started having panic attacks because she didn't know what to do. Later, she told me that she understood how I felt because I have an anxiety disorder that causes me to experience panic attacks. Eventually, after the night when I almost got stabbed, she decided that she had to call the cops. She couldn't take the chance that they would hurt me. She had to do something about it, and what she found out was shocking. Adrian was also known to the police, and my mom told them the story. He was so well known that they weren't even surprised to hear her story. In fact, they told her Adrian had done this exact same thing at least to a dozen other men. She would meet and blackmail men into giving her money, electronics, drugs, etc., threatening to call the cops and report them for rape if they did not. Her boyfriend, who was a dealer of other drugs other than just weed, as it turned out, would often use his drug connections to intimidate and extort the men, and for some reason, he never questioned her stories of being raped, abused, and enslaved by all of the other different types of men. Adrian was a crack and heroin addict and a prostitute who would get arrested on possession and drug distribution charges. She would attempt to make deals with the police by offering them information about men who were pedophiles in exchange for less time in prison. She eventually did this so many times that the police stopped believing in her. After my mom called the cops, the whole story came undone, and Adrian and her boyfriend, thankfully, haven't bothered us since. But it's been over a year since the whole thing happened, and I'm still terrified to leave the curtains open at nighttime in case somebody is watching me. I don't think I'll ever be able to feel fully safe in this house ever again. So Adrian, let's not meet again, ever.